when 4-year-old Marcus burst into billionaire CEO Jonathan Sterling's boardroom and declared, "You look like my daddy." The powerful executive had no idea that the phone call he'd received 20 minutes later would shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The 38th floor of Sterling Tower gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights that never dimmed, casting sharp shadows across the mahogany conference table where 12 of Manhattan's most influential executives sat in tense silence. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the October sun had long since disappeared behind the steel and glass canyon of Midtown, leaving only the distant glow of office buildings and the steady stream of traffic far below. The air conditioning hummed with mechanical precision, maintaining the exact temperature that Jonathan Sterling preferred for high-stakes negotiations. 68 degrees, cold enough to keep minds sharp and egos in check. Jonathan Sterling stood at the head of the conference table, his 6'2" frame commanding attention even in stillness. At 35, he possessed the kind of lean, athletic build that spoke of rigorous, personal discipline, a daily 5 a.m. workouts, precisely timed meals, and a schedule that accounted for every minute from dawn until well past midnight. His charcoal gray suit, tailored to perfection by a craftsman who charged more per garment than most people earned in a month, hung on his frame with understated authority. The subtle pinstripe pattern caught the light as he moved, and his platinum watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe that had appreciated in value since he'd purchased it 5 years earlier, glinted against his wrist as he gestured toward the presentation screen. "The Meridian acquisition represents more than market expansion," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had earned him a reputation as one of the most ruthless negotiators on Wall Street. "We're not just purchasing their client base or their intellectual property. We're eliminating a competitor that has consistently undervalued its assets while overestimating its market position." His steel gray eyes swept the room, pausing momentarily on each board member's face, reading micro-expressions with the precision of a master poker player. The numbers are unambiguous. Meridian's quarterly projections show a consistent pattern of over-optimistic forecasting coupled with underperforming execution. Their leadership team has demonstrated remarkable consistency in their inability to adapt to changing market conditions. Margaret Chen, Sterling Dynamics Chief Financial Officer, nodded approvingly as she reviewed the acquisition documents on her tablet. "The due diligence confirms Jonathan's assessment," she said, her voice crisp with the authority of someone who had dissected hundreds of companies over her 15-year career. "Meridian's debt-to-equity ratio has deteriorated by 37% over the past 18 months. Their core software platform, while innovative in concept, has failed to achieve the scalability metrics their investors were promised." David Ashworth, the longest-serving board member and Jonathan's former mentor, leaned back in his leather chair, studying the younger man with the calculating gaze that had made him legendary in venture capital circles. "The price point seems aggressive, even considering their vulnerabilities," he observed, his tone neutral but probing. $2.4 billion for a company that's hemorrhaging talent and market share. Are we confident in our integration projections?" Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, the subtle shift that occurred when his strategic thinking engaged at its highest level. "Meridian's value isn't in their current performance," he replied, moving to the presentation screen and pulling up a complex financial model. "It's in their research and development pipeline. They've invested $200 million over the past 3 years developing quantum encryption algorithms that won't reach commercial viability for another 18 months. By acquiring them now, we eliminate the competition for that technology while obtaining it at a fraction of its eventual market value." He clicked to the next slide, revealing projections that made several board members sit forward with renewed interest. Conservative estimates suggest the quantum encryption platform will generate $4.7 billion in revenue over the next decade. Aggressive but realistic projections put that figure closer to $8 billion. We're not just buying Meridian, we're purchasing the next generation of data security technology before the market fully comprehends its potential." The room fell silent as the implications settled in. This wasn't merely another corporate acquisition, it was the kind of strategic move that could define Sterling Dynamics' dominance for the next decade. Jonathan had built his reputation on these moment-seeing opportunities that others missed, identifying value that competitors overlooked, and executing with the precision that had transformed a modest software startup into a $12 billion empire. "The timeline is critical," Jonathan continued, his voice taking on the urgent edge that his team had learned to recognize as a prelude to decisive action. "3 other firms are circling Meridian. Tech Global submitted a preliminary offer last week, lowball, but it establishes them as serious contenders. Nexus Systems has been conducting their own due diligence for the past month. Every day we delay gives our competitors additional time to recognize what we've already identified." Sarah Mitchell, Sterling Dynamics' Chief Technology Officer, raised her hand slightly. "What about the integration challenges? Meridian's corporate culture is notoriously different from ours. They prioritize collaborative decision-making and consensus building. Our structure is more hierarchical." Jonathan's smile was sharp, predatory. "Corporate culture is a luxury that failing companies can't afford. Meridian's collaborative approach has produced precisely the results we'd expect from a committee-driven organization: delayed decision-making, diluted accountability, and compromised execution. After acquisition, we'll implement our operational standards. The talented employees will adapt. Those who can't will find opportunities elsewhere." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with board members raising concerns about regulatory approval, potential antitrust implications, and the logistics of integrating 2,000 employees into Sterling Dynamics' existing structure. Jonathan fielded each question with the methodical precision that had earned him comparison to legendary corporate raiders of previous generations. His answers were detailed, supported by data, and delivered with unwavering confidence. The Sterling Tower represented more than office space. It was a monument to Jonathan's vision and determination. 42 floors of steel, glass, and cutting-edge technology housed not just Sterling Dynamics headquarters, but also subsidiary companies, research laboratories, and the kind of advanced security systems typically reserved for government facilities. The building's lower levels contained data centers that hummed with the constant activity of servers processing millions of transactions daily. The middle floors housed development teams working on projects that wouldn't reach market for years. The upper levels, where Jonathan maintained his executive suite and conducted the most sensitive negotiations, offered panoramic views of Manhattan that reminded him daily of how far he had climbed. Security in Sterling Tower operated with military precision. The ground floor lobby required keycard access and facial recognition scanning. Elevators were programmed to restrict access based on clearance levels, ensuring that employees could only reach floors relevant to their responsibilities. The executive floors maintained additional security protocols: armed guards, motion sensors, and surveillance systems that recorded every movement. Jonathan had implemented these measures not from paranoia but from practical experience. Sterling Dynamics possessed intellectual property worth billions, and industrial espionage was a constant threat in their industry. Yet somehow, at 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, when the building's corridors should have been empty except for security personnel and the overnight cleaning crew, the conference room door burst open with such force that it banged against the wall, causing several board members to jump in their seats. The first thing everyone saw was the small figure silhouetted against the hallway lighting: a child, perhaps 4 years old, wearing faded jeans and a red sweater that had clearly seen better days. His dark hair was tousled as though he had been running, and his cheeks were flushed with excitement or exertion. He stood in the doorway for a moment, breathing heavily, his wide eyes taking in the formal scene before him with the fearless curiosity that only young children possess. "Marcus!" a woman's voice called from somewhere down the hallway, distant but urgent. "Marcus, where are you? Come back here right now!" The child Marcus stepped further into the conference room, seemingly unimpressed by the intimidating atmosphere or the dozen pairs of eyes staring at him in stunned silence. His gaze swept across the table, taking in the serious faces and expensive suits, before settling on Jonathan with sudden, intense focus. For several seconds, nobody moved. The board members sat frozen in a tableau of corporate authority, suddenly rendered absurd by the presence of a small child who clearly didn't belong in their rarefied environment. Jonathan felt a strange sensation wash over him, not quite recognition, but something deeper and more unsettling. The boy's face held a quality that seemed familiar in a way that Jonathan couldn't immediately place. Then Marcus raised a small finger, pointing directly at Jonathan with the unwavering certainty that only children possess when they've discovered something important. "You look like my daddy," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent conference room. The words hung in the air, like an accusation, simple and direct and completely devastating in their innocence. Jonathan felt his breath catch in his throat. The carefully controlled atmosphere of the meeting shattered, as though Marcus had thrown a stone through the polished surface of their corporate reality. Around the table, board members exchanged glances that ranged from confused to amused to deeply uncomfortable. Margaret Chen's pen froze halfway through a note she'd been writing. David Ashworth's eyebrows rose in an expression of surprise that, after 40 years in business, few things could provoke. The child continued staring at Jonathan with unblinking intensity, as though waiting for confirmation of his observation. His small face was serious now, studying Jonathan's features with the focused attention that children bring to puzzles they're determined to solve. "I'm sorry," Jonathan managed, his voice slightly hoarse. "I think you're confused. I don't." "Marcus!" The woman's voice was much closer now, filled with panic and embarrassment. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, moving quickly toward the conference room. "Marcus Anthony Collins, you come here this instant!" The boy ignored the approaching voice, taking another step into the room. "My mama says my daddy is important and wears fancy clothes like you," he continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "And your face looks like mine when I look in the mirror. See?" He pointed again, this time gesturing between Jonathan's face and his own. Jonathan found himself studying the child's features with growing unease. The resemblance that Marcus had identified wasn't imaginary. The boy's jawline, the shape of his eyes, even the way he held his head there, were similarities that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Dark hair, gray eyes that seemed almost silver in certain light, and a determined expression that reminded Jonathan uncomfortably of his own reflection. The conference room door was suddenly filled by a young woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, her face flushed with exertion and mortification. She wore the navy blue uniform of the building's cleaning service, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had come loose during what was obviously a frantic search. Her brown eyes were wide with embarrassment as she took in the scene, her son, standing in the middle of a high-level corporate meeting, pointing at the CEO of the company while a dozen executives stared in stunned silence. "Marcus, get away from there right now," she said, her voice firm but gentle as she moved toward her son. "I'm so sorry," she added, addressing the room in general while avoiding direct eye contact with any of the board members. "He wandered off while I was working. This won't happen again, I promise." Jonathan watched as she approached Marcus, noting the careful way she moved, deferential, apologetic, clearly aware that she and her son had transgressed into a world where they didn't belong. Her uniform was clean but worn, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who worked with industrial cleaning equipment. She reached for Marcus's hand, but the boy pulled away, still focused on Jonathan. "Mama, look! He looks like my daddy," Marcus insisted, his voice rising with excitement. "His face is the same as mine." The woman Sarah, Jonathan's mind supplied. Though he couldn't immediately recall how he knew her name, finally looked directly at him. When their eyes met, Jonathan felt a jolt of recognition that hit him like a physical blow. Not recent memory, but something from years past, buried under layers of career advancement and corporate achievement. Sarah's face went pale as she stared at him, her lips parting slightly in what might have been surprise or shock. For a moment, she seemed as frozen as the board members, her hands still reaching for Marcus, but her attention entirely focused on Jonathan's face. "Sarah," Jonathan said quietly, the name emerging from his lips without conscious thought. The sound of her name in his voice seemed to break whatever spell had held the room in suspended animation. Sarah blinked rapidly, then seemed to remember where they were and what was happening. She grabbed Marcus's hand with sudden urgency, lifting him despite his protests. "We need to go," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for the interruption. This won't happen again." She turned toward the door, Marcus still twisting in her arms to look back at Jonathan. "But Mama," the boy protested, "he looks like—" "Marcus, that's enough." Sarah cut him off firmly, though her voice remained gentle. She paused at the doorway, turning back briefly. "Mr. Sterling, I apologize for the disruption. We'll make sure." "Sarah, wait," Jonathan said, rising from his chair. The board members watched this exchange, with expressions ranging from confusion to fascination, clearly sensing undercurrents they didn't understand. But Sarah was already moving down the hallway, carrying Marcus despite his continued protests. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floors, growing fainter as she moved toward the service elevators. Jonathan stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the empty doorway where they had disappeared. The conference room felt different now, as though the brief intrusion had altered the very atmosphere of the space. The acquisition documents that had seemed so important minutes earlier now lay forgotten on the table. "Jonathan?" David Ashworth's voice broke through his thoughts. "Should we continue with the presentation?" Jonathan turned back to the table, noting the expectant faces of his board members. These were people accustomed to his decisive leadership, his ability to compartmentalize personal matters and focus on business objectives. They were waiting for him to dismiss the interruption and return to the critical decisions that required their attention. "Of course," Jonathan replied automatically, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Where were we?" Margaret Chen consulted her notes. "Integration timelines for the Meridian acquisition." Jonathan nodded, attempting to refocus on the presentation screen. But the numbers and projections that had captured his complete attention minutes earlier now seemed strangely irrelevant. Marcus's voice echoed in his mind. "You look like my daddy." The certainty in the child's tone, the way he had pointed with such confidence, the resemblance that even Jonathan couldn't deny. "The integration process will require approximately 6 months," Jonathan continued, but his delivery was mechanical, lacking the passionate conviction that usually characterized his presentations. "We'll need to establish transition teams for each major department." As he spoke, part of his mind remained focused on Sarah and Marcus. How had they gotten past security? Why had Sarah seemed to recognize him? And most importantly, why did Marcus's observation feel less like a mistake and more like a revelation? The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, covering contingency plans, budget allocations, and timeline adjustments. Jonathan participated in the discussions, answered questions, and provided the leadership his board expected. But beneath his professional demeanor, a growing unease had taken root, a feeling that the child's innocent observation had exposed something important that he had somehow forgotten or chosen to ignore. When the meeting finally concluded and the board members began gathering their materials, David Ashworth approached Jonathan privately. "Everything all right?" the older man asked, his tone carefully neutral. "You seemed a bit distracted after that interruption." Jonathan straightened his tie, a gesture that had become automatic when he needed to reassert control. "Just thinking through the security implications," he replied. "I'll need to review how that happened." David nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Jonathan's explanation. "If you need to discuss anything personally or professionally, my door is always open." After the last board member left, Jonathan remained in the conference room, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The city stretched endlessly in all directions, millions of lights representing millions of lives that intersected and separated in patterns too complex to predict or control. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, Sarah was tucking Marcus into bed, perhaps explaining why they had encountered the important man in the fancy suit, perhaps answering questions about daddies that she didn't know how to answer. Jonathan's reflection in the conference room window showed a successful man at the height of his career, surrounded by the trappings of power and achievement. But superimposed over that reflection was the memory of Marcus's face, the certainty in his young voice, and the uncomfortable possibility that the child had seen something that Jonathan had spent years trying not to remember. The acquisition deal that had dominated his thoughts for weeks now seemed like background noise compared to the questions that Marcus's appearance had raised. Jonathan had built his life on certainty, on controlling variables and predicting outcomes. But, as he stood alone in the conference room where his carefully ordered world had been disrupted by a 4-year-old's innocent observation, he realized that some truths couldn't be managed or negotiated away. His phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant, reminding him of an early morning meeting with international investors. The business of Sterling Dynamics would continue, the Meridian acquisition would proceed, and the corporate machine would function exactly as designed. But Jonathan Sterling, standing in his glass tower high above the city, felt as though something fundamental had shifted, something that couldn't be fixed with strategic planning or corporate restructuring. As the cleaning crew's lights moved through the building's lower floors, Jonathan wondered if Sarah was among them, if she was thinking about their brief encounter, if she was answering Marcus's questions about the man who looked like his daddy. The possibility that the child was right, that there was more than coincidental resemblance in their shared feature hung in the air like an unresolved chord, demanding resolution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new decisions that would shape Sterling Dynamics' future. But tonight, alone in his conference room, Jonathan Sterling faced the possibility that his past had just walked through his door in the form of a 4-year-old boy who saw things that adults had learned to overlook. The phone call that would change everything was still hours away, but the seed of transformation had already been planted by Marcus's simple, devastating observation, "You look like my daddy." Words that would echo in Jonathan's mind long after the conference room lights had been dimmed and the building had settled into its nighttime quiet. The Sterling Tower's executive elevator climbed silently through the building's steel and glass spine, carrying Jonathan to his penthouse office with the mechanical precision that characterized every aspect of his carefully ordered existence. The soft hum of the ascending car should have been soothing, a familiar transition between the collaborative environment of the boardroom and the solitary command center where he made the decisions that shaped Sterling Dynamics' future. Instead, the quiet felt oppressive, filled with echoes of a child's voice declaring with absolute certainty, "You look like my daddy." Jonathan's reflection in the elevator's polished steel doors showed a man in complete control-tailored suit, unwrinkled despite the late hour, posture erect, expression composed. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior, his mind churned with questions that defied the logical analysis he typically applied to complex problems. The numbers didn't add up, the timeline was wrong. Or perhaps, he thought with growing unease, the timeline was exactly right, and he had simply chosen not to examine it too closely. The elevator doors opened with a whisper, revealing the reception area of his executive suite. The space epitomized understated luxury. Italian marble floors, custom lighting that could be adjusted to complement any mood or time of day, and furniture selected not for comfort, but for the subtle messages it conveyed about power, taste, and success. Original artwork adorned the wall pieces he had acquired, not from passion, but from investment advisors who understood that art appreciation was expected of men in his position. His assistant, Maria Santos, had long since departed for the evening, leaving behind the precisely organized workspace that would greet him tomorrow morning. Prioritized messages arranged by urgency, calendar appointments, color-coded by importance, and briefing documents prepared for the early meetings that defined his days. The efficiency was remarkable, the attention to detail absolute. Yet tonight, the perfect order felt somehow inadequate, as though the systems that governed his professional life were insufficient to address the chaos that Marcus's appearance had introduced. Jonathan's private office occupied the building's northeast corner, offering panoramic views of Manhattan that never failed to remind him of his achievement. Two walls of floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city in all its nocturnal glory. Rivers of light flowing along avenues, towers piercing the darkness like illuminated monuments to ambition, and the distant glow of bridges spanning the waters that surrounded the island. During daylight hours, he could see Central Park's green expanse, the Metropolitan Museum's classical facade, and the endless stream of humanity moving through streets that pulsed with economic energy. Tonight, however, the view offered no satisfaction. Jonathan stood before the windows, loosening his tie with movements that had become automatic after years of late-night strategy sessions, but his attention remained focused inward. The Meridian acquisition documents lay spread across his desk, awaiting the detailed review that would normally consume his evening hours. Market analysis, financial projections, competitive assessments, all the data necessary to make informed decisions worth billions of dollars. Yet the papers remained untouched, as his mind replayed the evening's unexpected encounter. Marcus's face had possessed a quality that transcended mere physical resemblance. The child's expression, while pointing at Jonathan, had reflected absolute conviction, the kind of certainty that comes from recognizing something fundamental and true. Children, Jonathan knew from his limited experience with them, rarely questioned their perceptions the way adults did. They saw what they saw, spoke what they thought, and moved through the world with an honesty that sophisticated society spent considerable effort teaching them to suppress. The boy's features had been striking in their familiarity. Not just the obvious similarities, the dark hair, the gray eyes, the particular angle of the jawline, but something subtler and more unsettling. The way Marcus had held his head while studying Jonathan's face, the intensity of his gaze, even the confident manner in which he had entered the conference room uninvited. These were characteristics that Jonathan recognized because he saw them in his own reflection, behaviors that colleagues had commented on throughout his career. Sarah's appearance had been equally disturbing, though for different reasons. The moment their eyes met, Jonathan had experienced a recognition that bypassed conscious thought, accessing memories he had carefully compartmentalized and filed away. She had aged, naturally, but the changes only emphasized the qualities he remembered: intelligence in her brown eyes, determination in the set of her shoulders, and a natural grace that no uniform could disguise. Jonathan moved to his desk, settling into the leather chair that had been custom designed to support the long hours his position demanded. The Meridian files beckoned, promising the familiar comfort of quantifiable problems with calculable solutions. He opened the first folder, revealing detailed financial statements that should have captured his complete attention. Instead, his eyes scanned the numbers without processing their meaning, his analytical mind stubbornly refusing to engage with data that had seemed critical just hours earlier. His phone buzzed against the desk's polished surface, displaying a text message from David Ashworth. "Excellent presentation tonight. The Meridian vote should be unanimous. Sleep well." Jonathan stared at the message, realizing that he had nearly forgotten about the acquisition that had dominated his thoughts for weeks. The deal that would expand Sterling Dynamics' market position, eliminate a significant competitor, and generate billions in revenue had been reduced to background noise by a 4-year-old's innocent observation. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jonathan Sterling, who had built his reputation on focusing exclusively on objectives that mattered, found himself unable to concentrate on anything except an encounter that logically should have been dismissed as coincidental. Children often imagined resemblances to adults they encountered. Working mothers occasionally brought their offspring to office buildings. Security systems, however sophisticated, sometimes experienced lapses. All of these explanations were rational, probable, and completely unsatisfying. Jonathan's computer chimed softly, indicating the arrival of an urgent email. The sender was Thomas Brennan, a private investigator whom Jonathan had employed intermittently over the past decade for various corporate security matters. Brennan specialized in the kind of discreet inquiries that large corporations occasionally required: background checks on potential business partners, verification of credentials claimed by executive candidates, and investigation of industrial espionage attempts. The email's subject line was cryptic. Historical inquiry, status update. Jonathan frowned, clicking to open the message. Brennan's communication style was characteristically direct. Mr. Sterling, the laboratory results you requested are now available. Given the sensitive nature of these findings, I recommend discussing them by telephone rather than through electronic correspondence. Please call at your earliest convenience. The matter requires immediate attention. Jonathan stared at the message, confusion mixing with growing unease. He had no recollection of requesting laboratory results from Brennan, nor could he imagine what historical inquiry might require such urgent attention. Yet the investigator's tone suggested familiarity with a matter that Jonathan should remember but somehow didn't. He reached for his phone, scrolling through recent call logs and email exchanges, searching for context that might explain Brennan's message. Nothing in his recent communications provided clarification. The investigator's retainer was automatically renewed quarterly, and Jonathan occasionally requested routine background checks, but none of these standard services would involve laboratory analysis or produce findings deemed sensitive. Despite the late hour, Jonathan dialed Brennan's number. The investigator answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the time. Mr. Sterling, thank you for calling promptly. I realize this may seem confusing, given the elapsed time since your initial request. Thomas, I'm going to need you to refresh my memory, Jonathan admitted, settling back in his chair. I don't recall requesting any laboratory work. A pause. The DNA analysis, sir. You submitted a sample approximately 5 years ago, requesting comparison against a database of genetic profiles. You specified that the matter was personal rather than corporate, and that I should contact you only when definitive results became available. Jonathan felt something cold settle in his stomach. 5 years ago. The timeline aligned with a period he had deliberately chosen not to examine too closely, a time when certain suspicions had begun forming in his mind, suspicions he had ultimately decided not to pursue. The results are definitive? Jonathan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Completely. The sample you provided matches a profile in our database with a probability exceeding 99.7%. Given the statistical threshold for paternity determination, this constitutes absolute confirmation. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Paternity. The term he had avoided thinking, the possibility he had refused to acknowledge, even when doubts had begun forming years earlier. Suddenly, the timeline became clear, the context rushing back with uncomfortable clarity. 5 years ago, Jonathan had been experiencing a period of unusual introspection, triggered by his 31st birthday, and the realization that his relentless focus on career advancement had left certain personal matters unresolved. During that phase of questioning, he had remembered Sarah Collins and their brief relationship during his final year of graduate school. The timing of their involvement, followed by his abrupt departure for a prestigious internship, had occasionally troubled him in ways he hadn't wanted to examine. Acting on impulses he didn't fully understand, Jonathan had engaged Brennan to conduct a discreet inquiry into Sarah's circumstances. Not intrusive investigation, he had told himself, just basic verification that she was well and that their relationship's ending hadn't created complications he should address. The investigator had reported that Sarah was employed, living independently, and apparently healthy, but he had also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had a young child. The information had disturbed Jonathan more than he had anticipated. Mathematical calculation revealed that the child's approximate age aligned uncomfortably with the timeline of their relationship. Yet, rather than pursuing the matter directly, he had chosen what seemed like a compromise. Providing Brennan with a DNA sample and requesting comparison against any genetic material that might become available through routine background screening. It had been, Jonathan now realized, a coward's approach to a question he lacked the courage to ask directly. By delegating the inquiry to a third party and requesting notification only if definitive proof emerged, he had avoided taking responsibility for either pursuing the truth or accepting the implications of what that truth might reveal. The child's name, Jonathan said quietly, is Marcus. Marcus Anthony Collins, age 4 years and 7 months. Born at Mount Sinai Hospital on March 15. Mother listed as Sarah Elizabeth Collins, age 28. Father listed as unknown. Father listed as unknown. The phrase echoed in Jonathan's mind as he absorbed the magnitude of what Brennan was confirming. Marcus was his son. The child who had burst into his conference room with such confidence, who had pointed at him with absolute certainty, who had declared their resemblance with the fearless honesty of someone too young to understand the complexity of adult relationships. How did you obtain the genetic comparison? Jonathan asked, his legal training automatically raising questions about privacy and consent. Routine background screening during the mother's employment application process. Many corporations now require DNA sampling for security clearance purposes. The sample was obtained legally and with appropriate consent, though the subject was unaware of its potential comparison applications. Jonathan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decisions made and unmade over the past 5 years. He had known, on some level, that Marcus might be his child. The timing, the circumstances, even his instinctive decision to request DNA analysis, all of it, pointed to suspicions he had chosen not to acknowledge. Now, confronted with definitive proof, he could no longer maintain the comfortable ambiguity that had allowed him to focus exclusively on his career while avoiding personal responsibility. I need you to prepare a complete report on this matter, Jonathan said finally. Everything you've learned about Sarah Collins and her son, employment history, living situation, health records if available, educational background, all of it. The report has been ready for several weeks, pending your review. Shall I deliver it tonight? Yes. And Thomas, this information remains absolutely confidential. No one else is to know about these findings. Of course, sir. Complete discretion, as always. After ending the call, Jonathan sat motionless in his chair, staring out at the city lights without really seeing them. In the space of a few hours, his carefully ordered world had been fundamentally altered by 2 revelations: a child's innocent observation and a private investigator's clinical confirmation. Marcus was his son. The resemblance wasn't coincidental. The boy's certainty wasn't mistaken, and Sarah's reaction wasn't surprise but recognition. The implications cascaded through his mind, like dominoes, falling in predetermined patterns. Legal obligations, financial responsibilities, custody considerations, public relations, concern saw the practical matters that would require attention once this news became known. But beneath the logistical challenges lay a more fundamental question. What kind of father would he be to a child he had never known existed? Jonathan's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from his building's security director. Mr. Sterling, I apologize for the late hour, but I wanted to personally address the security breach that occurred during your meeting. Yes. How did a child access the executive floors? The boy accompanied his mother, who was part of the overnight cleaning crew. She has worked for our contracted service for the past 3 years with an excellent record. Apparently, her regular babysitter canceled at the last minute, and she made the decision to bring her son rather than miss her shift. The child wandered away while she was working on the 36th floor. 3 years. Jonathan calculated quickly. Marcus would have been barely 2 when Sarah began working in his building. Had she known he was here? Had she taken the job hoping for some kind of encounter? Or was it simply another twist of fate in a situation already rich with irony? What's the standard policy for contractors bringing family members to work? Jonathan asked. Strictly prohibited, sir. The cleaning service supervisor has been notified, and the employee has been terminated effective immediately. Terminated. The word hit Jonathan harder than it should have. Sarah had lost her job because of tonight's encounter, because Marcus had wandered into the conference room and made his innocent declaration. The child's search for his father had cost his mother her livelihood. Reverse that decision, Jonathan said quickly. The termination is rescinded. The employee made an error in judgment, but her work record otherwise is excellent. Arrange alternative childcare support if necessary, but she keeps her position. A pause. "Sir, this creates a precedent that might encourage other contractors to—" "The decision is final. Handle it quietly, but make sure she understands that her job is secure." Jonathan ended the call, wondering if his intervention would seem suspicious to the security director. But the alternative, allowing Sarah to suffer professionally because her son had recognized their biological connection, was unacceptable. He might not understand his responsibilities as a father yet, but he could at least ensure that Marcus's revelation didn't create immediate hardship for his mother. As he waited for Brennan's report, Jonathan's mind drifted back to his relationship with Sarah, memories he had carefully archived but never quite forgotten. Graduate school at Columbia had been the most challenging period of his life, intellectually stimulating but financially precarious. Filled with ambitious classmates competing for limited opportunities while surviving on student loans and part-time employment. Sarah had been working toward her degree in early childhood education, balancing coursework with a job at the university's daycare center. Their paths had crossed in the library during finals week of his second year, when she had been studying alone, at a table surrounded by educational psychology textbooks, while he had been reviewing case studies for his business law exam. She had looked up from her reading, noticed his obvious exhaustion, and offered him half of her sandwich, a simple gesture that had somehow penetrated the competitive isolation that graduate school encouraged. They had begun talking, initially about the stress of academic pressure, but eventually about their plans, their fears, and their dreams for lives beyond the university's protective bubble. The relationship that followed had been unlike anything Jonathan had experienced before or since. Sarah possessed a warmth and authenticity that contrasted sharply with the calculated networking that characterized most of his social interactions. She was genuinely interested in his ideas, supportive of his ambitions, but also willing to challenge his assumptions when she thought he was being unnecessarily harsh or dismissive. Their time together had been constrained by demanding schedules and limited finances, but they had made the most of stolen hours between classes and study sessions. Long walks through Morningside Park while discussing everything from educational theory to corporate strategy. Quiet evenings in her tiny apartment, sharing inexpensive meals while she helped him prepare for presentations. Weekend mornings when they would read newspapers together, debating politics and social issues with the passionate intensity of people who believed their opinions could change the world. Jonathan had been falling in love with her, he realized now, though he had never allowed himself to acknowledge it at the time. Love seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford while building the foundation for his future career. Success required focus, sacrifice, and the willingness to prioritize long-term objectives over immediate emotional satisfaction. The end had come suddenly, triggered by an opportunity that seemed too important to refuse. Harrison Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious consulting firms, had offered Jonathan a summer internship that could lead to a full-time position after graduation. The offer was extraordinary. Not just the financial compensation, but the access to high-level clients and the chance to work on projects that would shape his understanding of corporate strategy. There had been only one complication. The internship required immediate availability and complete commitment. 16-hour days, weekend work, international travel, and the understanding that personal relationships would need to be suspended for the duration of the program. Partners at Harrison Associates were explicit about their expectations. The internship was a test of dedication that would determine whether candidates possessed the focus necessary for careers at the highest levels of business. Jonathan had accepted without hesitation, justifying the decision as an investment in their future. After establishing himself professionally, he would be in a position to build the kind of life that Sarah deserved. The temporary sacrifice would enable permanent security. Sarah had understood, or at least she had seemed to understand. Their final conversation had been brief, conducted in the library where they had first met. She had listened as he explained the opportunity, the requirements, and the temporary nature of their separation. Her response had been characteristically generous. She wanted him to succeed. She appreciated his honesty about the situation's demands, and she would miss him but wouldn't allow personal feelings to interfere with his professional development. They had parted with promises to reconnect after the internship ended, but Jonathan's immersion in Harrison, as associate's demanding environment, had made communication increasingly difficult. 12 weeks of intensive work had extended into a full-time offer, then a promotion, then the launching of his own firm with clients acquired through connections made during the internship. By the time Jonathan had established sufficient professional stability to reconnect with Sarah, nearly 2 years had passed. He had called her number, only to learn that it had been disconnected. A visit to Columbia's campus had revealed that she had completed her degree and moved away, leaving no forwarding information. At the time, Jonathan had interpreted her disappearance as confirmation that their relationship had been as temporary as he had assumed. She had moved on with her life, just as he was doing with his. The timing had seemed convenient mutual dissolution, without the complications that often accompanied romantic endings. Now, understanding the fuller context, Jonathan realized how completely he had misunderstood the situation. Sarah hadn't moved on, she had moved away. The difference was crucial and heartbreaking. Brennan's knock interrupted his reflection. Jonathan opened the door to find the investigator holding a thick manila envelope, his expression professionally neutral despite the late hour. "The complete report," Brennan said, handing over the documents. "Sarah Elizabeth Collins, comprehensive background and current status." "The key findings?" Jonathan asked, though he wasn't sure he was prepared for the answers. "Subject completed her education degree 6 months after you last had contact, with academic honors, despite what appears to have been a challenging final semester. She gave birth to Marcus 3 months later, then moved to her current residence in Queens. Employment history shows consistent work in educational and caregiving roles, with character references consistently rating her as reliable, dedicated, and excellent with children. Financial situation? Stable but modest. She receives no external support for child-rearing expenses. The boy has never had contact with his biological father, according to child care enrollment forms that consistently list the father as unknown." Jonathan absorbed this information, each fact adding weight to the growing realization of what Sarah had endured alone. She had completed her degree while pregnant, given birth without support, and spent nearly 5 years raising their son as a single mother while working multiple jobs to maintain their financial stability. "Any indication that she sought contact with me?" Jonathan asked, dreading the answer. Brennan consulted his notes. "No evidence of any attempts to locate you or communicate regarding the child. Her employment at Sterling Tower appears coincidental, responded to a general posting for cleaning positions, and was hired based on her qualifications and references." The weight of this revelation was staggering. Sarah hadn't been seeking him out, hadn't been trying to create an encounter or make demands. She had simply been working to support their son, accepting whatever employment she could find, raising Marcus with the same dedication she had brought to everything else in her life. Jonathan thought about the moment, in the conference room, when their eyes had met. The expression he had interpreted as recognition was probably shock, the sudden, unwelcome realization that her carefully maintained distance from his world had been accidentally breached by her son's innocent curiosity. "There's one more thing," Brennan continued. "The boy has been asking questions about his father recently, according to daycare providers. Standard curiosity for a child his age, but Sarah has apparently been struggling with how to address his questions without providing information she doesn't have." Information she doesn't have. The phrase echoed in Jonathan's mind as he closed the investigator's report. Sarah had been fielding Marcus's questions about his father while possessing only incomplete knowledge herself. She knew who the father was, but not whether he was aware of his son's existence, not whether he would welcome contact, not whether his life had space for the complication that a child would represent. After Brennan departed, Jonathan remained in his office, staring at the report without opening it. The Meridian acquisition files still lay spread across his desk, awaiting attention that seemed increasingly unlikely to come tonight. Tomorrow would bring meetings that had been scheduled weeks in advance, decisions that would affect thousands of employees, and opportunities that could shape Sterling Dynamics' future for years to come. Yet all of these concerns felt secondary to the fundamental question that Marcus's appearance had forced him to confront. What kind of man was he, and what kind of father could he become? Jonathan Sterling had built his identity around achievement, control, and the relentless pursuit of excellence in measurable terms. He understood market dynamics, competitive strategy, and organizational leadership. He could analyze complex data, negotiate billion-dollar deals, and make decisions that created or destroyed vast amounts of wealth. But he had no experience with 4-year-olds who wandered into conference rooms seeking fathers they had never met. He knew nothing about bedtime stories, playground politics, or the particular challenges of raising a child whose intelligence already exceeded that of many adults. Most importantly, he had no framework for understanding what Marcus needed from him, or what Sarah expected now that their secret was no longer secret. The phone call from Brennan had provided answers to questions Jonathan hadn't known he was asking, but it had also opened new areas of uncertainty that no amount of strategic planning could resolve. Tomorrow, he would need to decide not just how to proceed with a corporate acquisition, but how to proceed with a life that had suddenly become far more complicated than he had ever intended. As Manhattan settled into the quiet hours before dawn, Jonathan Sterling sat alone in his tower office, surrounded by evidence of everything he had achieved, confronting the possibility that his greatest success might require him to become someone entirely different from the man he had spent decades becoming. The fluorescent lights of Sterling Tower's parking garage cast harsh shadows across the concrete as Jonathan waited beside his black Mercedes S-Class, checking his watch for the 4th time in 10 minutes. 3 days had passed since Marcus's unexpected appearance in his boardroom. 3 days of sleepless nights spent reading Brennan's comprehensive report and rehearsing conversations that never seemed adequate to the magnitude of what needed to be said. The DNA results sat in a sealed envelope in his briefcase, scientific confirmation of what his heart had already accepted as truth. At 11:47 p.m., the service elevator doors opened with a mechanical whisper, disgorging a small group of uniformed workers who moved with the tired efficiency of people finishing long shifts. Jonathan recognized Sarah immediately, her dark hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail, her shoulders carrying the slight stoop that came from hours spent bent over cleaning equipment. She walked with 2 other women, their conversation muted but animated, probably discussing the small dramas and victories that filled working lives. Sarah stopped abruptly when she noticed Jonathan standing beside his car, her companions continuing toward the employee exit without realizing she was no longer with them. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Across the distance of the garage, 2 people separated by more than the 20 feet of oil-stained concrete between them. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah said finally, her voice carefully neutral as he approached. "Is there something wrong with my work? I was told my job was secure after the incident the other night." Jonathan felt an unexpected pang at her formality, the way she held herself with defensive dignity despite the late hour and unglamorous circumstances. "Please, call me Jonathan. And no, your work is fine. Excellent, actually. I wanted to speak with you about something else. If this is about Marcus wandering into your meeting, I've already apologized. I've made arrangements to ensure it won't happen again." "It's not about the meeting," Jonathan said, then hesitated, realizing how inadequate all of his rehearsed approaches seemed when faced with the reality of her presence. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about Marcus. About us. About what happened 5 years ago." Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, wariness replacing the professional courtesy she had maintained. "There's nothing to discuss. What happened between us was a long time ago, and it doesn't affect my work performance." "It affects more than that." Jonathan reached into his briefcase, withdrawing the envelope that contained the DNA results. "I had a test done. Marcus is my son." The words hung in the fluorescent-lit air between them, stark and irreversible. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and something that might have been fear before, settling into a mask of controlled composure that reminded Jonathan uncomfortably of his own boardroom demeanor. "You had no right," she said quietly. but with an intensity that made the simple words feel like an accusation. No right to investigate us, to test anything without my knowledge or consent. I had every right to know if I had a child, Jonathan replied, then immediately regretted the defensive tone. This wasn't a negotiation or a corporate dispute. It was a conversation about his son's future, and his approach was already failing. You had 4.5 years to wonder about that, Sarah shot back, her careful composure cracking to reveal the anger beneath. 4.5 years to pick up a phone, to ask questions, to show any interest whatsoever in what happened after you walked away. Now you appear with test results and declarations about your rights? Jonathan felt the familiar urge to control the conversation, to present logical arguments that would override emotional objections. But looking at Sarah's face, the exhaustion that ran deeper than one night's work, the protective fury that sparkled in her eyes, the way she held herself as though preparing for battle, he realized that logic was insufficient for this situation. "You're right," he said simply. "I should have asked questions 5 years ago. I should have made sure you were okay when I left for the internship. I should have tried to find you when I got established. I didn't, and I can't change that. But I know now, and I want to be part of Marcus's life." "Want?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced around the empty garage. "You want to be part of his life? Like it's something you can decide to add to your schedule when it's convenient?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Jonathan? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a very successful man has suddenly discovered he has a son and wants to play father without understanding what that actually involves." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Jonathan had been thinking about Marcus in terms of responsibilities and opportunities, legal obligations and financial provisions. He had considered the practical aspects of paternity custody arrangements, education planning, trust fund establishment. But he hadn't really contemplated the daily reality of being a father to a 4-year-old boy. "I want to learn," he said finally. "I want to know him, and I want him to know me. I realize I don't understand what being a father means, but I'm willing to figure it out." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he hoped she would find. "Marcus has been asking about his father lately," she admitted reluctantly, "wondering why he doesn't have a daddy like other kids at daycare. I've been trying to figure out how to answer his questions without." "Without what?" "Without lying to him, but also without setting him up for disappointment if his father turned out to be someone who wouldn't want him." The implication hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Sarah had been protecting Marcus not just from his absence, but from the possibility that his presence might be worse than his absence. She had considered the scenario where Jonathan might acknowledge his paternity but reject his son, leaving Marcus with the knowledge that his father existed but didn't want a relationship. "I would never reject him," Jonathan said quietly. "How could I know that? How could I risk it?" Sarah's voice carried years of careful consideration, of weighing options that all seemed inadequate. "You're a billionaire, Jonathan. You move in circles where a working-class single mother and her son would be embarrassments. How could I know you wouldn't see us as problems to be managed rather than people to be loved?" The question revealed assumptions that Jonathan was only beginning to understand. Sarah had constructed their separation not just as the end of a relationship, but as a protection against potential rejection that would be infinitely more damaging than his simple absence. She had chosen certainty over hope, security over the possibility of disappointment. "Where do you live?" Jonathan asked suddenly. "Why?" "I want to see where my son lives. I want to understand his world before I try to bring him into mine." Sarah hesitated, clearly torn between her protective instincts and her recognition that this conversation would need to continue beyond a parking garage. "He's asleep," she said finally. "It's almost midnight. I'm not going to wake him. I just want to see." 20 minutes later, Jonathan followed Sarah's 15-year-old Honda Civic through the streets of Queens, his Mercedes conspicuously out of place among the modest cars that lined the residential neighborhood. The buildings here were low-rise apartments and small houses, aging but well-maintained, with tiny yards and chain-link fences that spoke of working families making the most of limited resources. Sarah's apartment building was a three-story brick structure that had probably been built in the 1950s, functional rather than attractive but solid and clean. She led Jonathan up a narrow staircase to the second floor, past walls painted in institutional green and lit by fixtures that provided adequate illumination without any pretense of style. "It's not much," Sarah said, as she unlocked the door to apartment 2C. "But it's safe, and it's ours." The interior of the apartment revealed a space that was small but carefully organized, every square foot utilized with the efficiency born of necessity. The living room contained a sofa that had clearly been purchased second-hand but was covered with a colorful throw that brightened the room. Bookshelves made from painted boards and concrete blocks lined one wall, filled with an eclectic mixture of children's books, educational texts, and paperback novels. A small television sat on a table that also served as Marcus's desk, judging by the child-sized chair and scattered crayons. What struck Jonathan most forcefully was the evidence of deliberate care in every detail. The apartment might be modest, but it was clean, organized, and filled with touches that spoke of love rather than expense. Drawings that were obviously Marcus's work had been framed and hung at child height along the hallway. A small kitchen table was set for breakfast, complete with Marcus's favorite cereal bowl and a cup decorated with cartoon characters. "He's through there," Sarah whispered, pointing toward a doorway partially concealed by a hanging blanket that served as a makeshift room divider. Jonathan moved quietly toward the opening, pausing at the threshold of what was clearly Marcus's bedroom. The space was tiny, barely large enough for a single bed, a small dresser, and a bookshelf, but it had been transformed into a child's sanctuary. Glow-in-the-dark stars had been applied to the ceiling in constellation patterns. Stuffed animals arranged on the bed suggested bedtime rituals involving careful selection and positioning. A mobile hanging above the headboard featured airplanes that caught the light from a street lamp outside the single window. Marcus lay curled beneath a comforter, decorated with dinosaurs, his dark hair tousled against a pillow, his face relaxed in the absolute peace that only children achieve during deep sleep. Jonathan found himself holding his breath as he studied his son's features, seeing not just the resemblances that others had noted, but the unique characteristics that belonged entirely to Marcus. The slight upturn of his nose that came from Sarah, the way his hands were positioned near his face, the peaceful expression that suggested dreams filled with adventures rather than worries. This was his child, not an abstract concept or a legal obligation, but a small person with preferences and habits and dreams, someone who had been living and growing and learning for over 4 years without any knowledge of his father's existence. Jonathan felt something shift inside his chest, an emotion too complex for simple identification but profound enough to change how he saw everything else in his life. "He usually sleeps through the night now," Sarah whispered from behind him. "But he's been having more dreams lately, asking questions about his father when he wakes up." Jonathan reluctantly stepped back from the doorway, following Sarah to the living room where they could speak without risking waking Marcus. The apartment's main space felt even smaller after seeing the careful way every inch had been utilized to create a home for his son. "How do you manage?" Jonathan asked, genuinely curious rather than judgmental. "The space, the expenses, everything involved in raising him alone?" Sarah settled onto the sofa, gesturing for him to take the single chair. "You adapt. You prioritize. You make choices about what's important and what's optional." She looked around the apartment with obvious pride despite its limitations. Marcus has never lacked for anything essential. He has books, toys, activities. He knows he's loved. The apartment is small, but it's stable, and that's what matters at his age. Jonathan absorbed this, trying to imagine the daily logistics of their life. Sarah working multiple jobs to afford rent and childcare. Marcus adapting to various babysitters and daycare situations, both of them navigating the complexities of single parenthood in a city that was expensive and demanding even for people with substantial resources. "I could help," Jonathan said carefully. "Financial support, better housing, educational opportunities." "And what would you want in return?" Sarah's question was direct, cutting through any pretense of simple generosity. Time with him. The chance to know my son. On what terms? Weekend visits? Summer vacations? Or are you thinking about custody arrangements and legal agreements? Jonathan realized he hadn't thought that far ahead. His impulse was to solve problems systematically, but the problems of family life didn't lend themselves to systematic solutions. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what's normal or what's best for Marcus. I just know I want to be his father. Being his father isn't something you can decide to do, Jonathan. It's something you have to become, day by day, choice by choice. It means putting his needs before your schedule, his happiness before your convenience, his future before your plans. The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Sarah wasn't just protecting Marcus from disappointment, she was testing Jonathan's commitment, trying to determine whether his interest in fatherhood would survive contact with its daily realities. I understand that, Jonathan said, though he wasn't sure he truly did. I'm willing to learn. I want to learn. Before Sarah could respond, a small voice called from the bedroom. Mama, I had a dream about the man who looks like me. Sarah's expression immediately shifted to maternal concern. Coming, sweetheart, she called softly, then looked at Jonathan with something between apology and warning. He can't see you here. Not yet. Not until we figure out how to handle this. But Marcus appeared in the doorway before Sarah could reach him, rubbing his eyes and wearing pajamas decorated with rocket ships. When he saw Jonathan sitting in their living room, his face lit up with pure delight. You came to visit? Marcus exclaimed, his sleepy confusion immediately replaced by excitement. I knew you would. I told Mama you looked like my daddy, and now you're here. Jonathan felt his heart stop as Marcus approached him without hesitation, climbing onto his lap with the trusting confidence that children reserve for people they instinctively recognized as safe. The boy's weight was slight but warm, his small hands reaching up to touch Jonathan's face with curious fascination. You do look like me, Marcus said seriously, studying Jonathan's features with intense concentration. Same eyes, same chin. Are you really my daddy? Jonathan looked helplessly at Sarah, who stood frozen in the center of the small living room, her expression cycling through panic, resignation, and something that might have been relief. This wasn't how she had planned to handle the revelation, but Marcus had forced the moment with his characteristic directness. Yes, Jonathan said quietly, the word feeling enormous in the small apartment. I'm your daddy. Marcus absorbed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to major life changes. I knew it, he said with satisfaction. I told everyone at daycare that my daddy was important and wore fancy clothes, and now everyone will see I was right. The innocence of his response was heartbreaking. Marcus had no understanding of the complexities that had kept his parents apart, no awareness of the difficult conversations that lay ahead, no concept of how his life might change now that his father had entered their world. For him, the situation was simple. He had found his daddy, and his daddy had come to visit. Can you read me a story? Marcus asked, sliding off Jonathan's lap to retrieve a book from the shelf. Mama usually reads to me, but she says daddies can read stories too. Jonathan accepted the picture book. Something about a dragon who was afraid of Flyingand found himself on the sofa with Marcus curled against his side, small fingers tracing the illustrations, while Jonathan read aloud in a voice that seemed to belong to someone else. The story was simple, designed for a child's attention span, but Jonathan found himself studying each page with unusual care, trying to understand what Marcus saw in the colorful drawings and simple text. You read good, Marcus announced when the story ended, but you have to do the dragon voice differently. Dragons should sound scary, but not too scary because then I can't sleep. Jonathan attempted a dragon voice that made Marcus giggle, a sound that seemed to fill the small apartment with more warmth than its aging heating system could provide. For several minutes, they practiced character voices, with Marcus offering detailed feedback on proper storytelling techniques. Sarah watched this interaction from the kitchen doorway, her expression unreadable. Jonathan caught her eye over Marcus's head, trying to convey his own amazement at how natural this felt. How right it seemed to have his son curled against his side, demanding stories and offering critiques of his narrative performance. "Okay, sweetheart," Sarah said finally. "Back to bed. You have daycare in the morning." "Can Daddy tuck me in?" Marcus asked, using the word with casual confidence that suggested he had already incorporated Jonathan's presence into his understanding of family. Jonathan looked to Sarah for permission, receiving a slight nod that felt like a significant concession. He followed Marcus to the tiny bedroom, helping the boy arrange his stuffed animals in their proper positions and listening to a detailed explanation of each toy's name and personality. "Will you be here when I wake up?" Marcus asked as Jonathan pulled the dinosaur comforter up to his chin. "I don't know," Jonathan answered honestly. "Your mama and I need to talk about how this is going to work. But you're not going to disappear again, right? Because I just found you." The question contained such trust and hope that Jonathan felt something break apart inside his chest. "I'm not going to disappear," he promised, meaning it more completely than he had ever meant anything in his life. After Marcus settled back into sleep, Jonathan returned to the living room to find Sarah standing at the window, looking out at the street where his Mercedes sat like an alien artifact among the practical cars that belonged in this neighborhood. "He's going to expect you to be part of his life now?" Sarah said without turning around. "You can't visit once and then decide this is too complicated. He won't understand that kind of rejection. I told you, I'm not going to disappear." People say things they don't mean when children are looking at them with hope. Sarah faced him finally, her expression serious. "Marcus has never been disappointed by a father because he's never had one to disappoint him. If you're going to be in his life, you have to be all the way in, not just when it's convenient or exciting." Jonathan understood the warning, but he also sensed something else in her tone, a reluctant acknowledgement that Marcus's immediate acceptance of him had changed the dynamic between them. Their son had made his own decision about wanting his father in his life, removing some of Sarah's protective control over the situation. "What happens now?" Jonathan asked. "I don't know." Sarah's admission carried a weight of uncertainty that she had clearly been avoiding contemplating. "I've spent 5 years building a life that didn't include you. Marcus's routines, his expectations, our financial arrangements, everything is structured around it being just the two of us. I could help with the financial aspects immediately. Better apartment, better neighborhood, educational opportunities. And what happens when the novelty wears off? When being a father turns out to be harder than you expected? Marcus would have gotten used to a different kind of life, and then what?" The questions revealed the depth of her concern. Sarah wasn't just protecting Marcus from potential rejection, she was protecting him from the possibility of losing a lifestyle improvement that he might come to depend on. If Jonathan provided financial support and then withdrew it, Marcus would suffer the double loss of his father's presence and the security that presence had provided. "I understand your caution," Jonathan said, "but I can't prove my commitment without the opportunity to demonstrate it. We're going to have to trust each other, at least initially." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen, her expression immediately changing to one of alarm. "What is it?" Jonathan asked. "My neighbor. She says there are photographers outside the building." Jonathan moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain to look down at the street. Several cars had appeared since his arrival, and he could see the distinctive silhouettes of people with professional cameras positioned across from the building's entrance. "How did they find out?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Jonathan's mind raced through the possibilities. His presence at the building could have been noted by paparazzi who routinely monitored his movements. His departure from Sterling Tower at an unusual hour might have prompted questions. Or someone in the building might have recognized him and shared the information. "They don't know anything specific yet," Jonathan said, trying to maintain calm despite the growing crisis. "But they've clearly connected me to this address." Sarah sank onto the sofa, her face pale. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Marcus's privacy, our privacy, it's all going to be gone." Jonathan's phone rang, displaying his publicist's number. Melissa Chen worked around the clock managing Sterling Dynamics media relations, but calls at this hour usually indicated significant problems. "Jonathan, we have a situation." Melissa's voice was crisp despite the late hour. "Photos of you entering a Queens apartment building are already online. The speculation is that you have a secret family. I need to know how you want to handle this." "No comment for now," Jonathan replied, watching Sarah's growing distress. "I'll call you in the morning with a strategy. The story is already gaining traction. If there's truth to the speculation, we need to get ahead of it before the narrative gets away from us." Jonathan ended the call, turning back to Sarah. "I'm sorry, I didn't think about the media attention." "Of course you didn't," Sarah said, but without bitterness. "This is your normal life. Having photographers follow you, having your personal business become public entertainment. But it's not Marcus's normal life. It's not mine." Through the window, Jonathan could see that more vehicles had arrived. The photographers were setting up for what appeared to be a long surveillance operation, waiting for movement that would provide them with the photos and information they needed to construct their story. "Is there another way out of the building?" Jonathan asked. "Fire escape in the back, but that leads to an alley that connects to the main street. They'll see any movement." Jonathan realized that his presence had effectively trapped Sarah and Marcus in their own home. His attempt to quietly enter their lives had instead created exactly the kind of public spectacle that would make normal family life impossible. "Pack a bag," he said suddenly, "for you and Marcus, enough for a few days." "What?" "You can't stay here tonight. The photographers will camp outside until they get the story they want. Every time you leave for work or take Marcus to daycare, they'll be there. You need to be somewhere private until we figure out how to handle this." Sarah stared at him, clearly torn between the practical necessity of his suggestion and her reluctance to accept help that would make her dependent on his resources. "Where would we go?" "My apartment. It has security, privacy. Marcus would be safe there." "Your apartment." Sarah repeated the words as though testing their implications. "Moving into your world, just like you planned." "It's not about my world or your world," Jonathan said, though he realized how naive that sounded. "It's about protecting Marcus from this media circus." Through the thin walls of the apartment, they could hear a phone ringing in the unit next door, followed by excited conversation. The story was spreading through the building, neighbors comparing notes about the photographers and speculating about their presence. "Mama?" Marcus's sleepy voice called from the bedroom. "There are lights outside my window." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, the weight of decisions she had hoped to avoid settling on her shoulders. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart," she called. "Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The private conversation, that should have taken place over time, allowing for careful consideration and gradual adjustment, had been forced into crisis mode by media attention that neither of them had anticipated or wanted. "One night," Sarah said finally. "We'll come for one night, until the photographers lose interest." Jonathan nodded, though he suspected that one night would not be sufficient to resolve the situation they now faced. The discovery of his son would be international news within hours, making privacy a luxury that none of them could afford until the story played out in whatever way the media decided was most entertaining. As Sarah quietly packed a bag for herself and Marcus, Jonathan stood at the window watching the photographers position themselves for the vigil that would last until they got the confirmation they needed. His attempt to privately reconnect with his son had already become a public spectacle, transforming Marcus from a child with a normal life into the subject of tabloid speculation. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jonathan Sterling, who had spent his entire career controlling information and managing public perception, had lost control of the most important story of his life within hours of its beginning. And now, instead of slowly building a relationship with his son, he was about to uproot Marcus from everything familiar and bring him into a world that was as foreign to the child as fatherhood was to Jonathan. The two different worlds that had existed in careful separation for 5 years were about to collide, with a 4-year-old boy caught in the middle, blissfully unaware that his simple joy in finding his daddy was about to change everything for all of them. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jonathan's penthouse, casting geometric patterns across the polished marble floors as Marcus stood transfixed before the panoramic view of Manhattan spread out 43 stories below. The child pressed his small hands against the glass, his breath fogging the spotless surface as he tried to comprehend the vast urban landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. "I can see everything from here," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with the kind of awe that adults rarely experienced but children encountered daily. "It's like being in an airplane, but we're standing still." Jonathan watched his son from the kitchen doorway, coffee mug forgotten in his hands, as he absorbed the simple wonder in Marcus's voice. The penthouse that had once represented the pinnacle of his professional achievement now felt simultaneously too large and too small, spacious enough to house a family but sterile in ways that became painfully obvious when viewed through a 4-year-old's eyes. Sarah emerged from the guest bedroom, her hair still damp from a shower, wearing one of the casual outfits Jonathan had arranged to be delivered the previous evening along with clothing for Marcus. The designer jeans and silk blouse fit her perfectly, thanks to information his assistant had discreetly gathered, but Sarah moved through the luxurious space with the careful precision of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "Marcus, come eat breakfast," she called. Though her tone carried the gentle weariness of someone who had slept poorly in a strange place despite the Egyptian cotton sheets and custom mattress that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Look, Mama," Marcus pointed excitedly toward Central Park, where early morning joggers traced paths through the green space like distant ants. "We can see the whole park. And those tiny cars down there, they look like my toy cars." Jonathan approached slowly, still learning to gauge the appropriate distance for interactions with his son. "Would you like to use these?" he offered, producing a pair of compact binoculars from a nearby drawer. "They'll make everything appear closer." Marcus accepted the binoculars with the reverent care he might show a magical artifact, holding them up to his eyes and adjusting the focus with surprising dexterity. "Whoa! Now I can see the people jogging. And there's a dog park with lots of dogs." "That's the sheep meadow," Jonathan explained, moving to stand beside Marcus at the window. "In the summer, people have picnics there. And over there, do you see the lake? People row boats on it." "Can we go there? Can we row a boat?" Marcus's questions tumbled out with the rapid-fire enthusiasm that characterized his approach to new information. Jonathan glanced at Sarah, seeking guidance about promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The media attention that had driven them to seek refuge in his penthouse showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, the overnight speculation had intensified, with photographers maintaining positions outside the building and social media buzzing with theories about Jonathan Sterling's secret family. "Maybe when things calm down a little," Sarah answered diplomatically, though her expression suggested skepticism about when that might occur. The breakfast table in Jonathan's dining room could comfortably seat 12, its polished surface reflecting the Waterford crystal chandelier that hung above it like a frozen constellation. Marcus climbed onto a chair that was clearly designed for adults, his feet dangling well above the floor as he surveyed the elaborate place setting that Jonathan's housekeeper had prepared. "Why are there so many forks?" Marcus asked, studying the silver utensils with scientific curiosity. "Do different forks taste different?" Jonathan realized he had no idea how to explain formal dining protocols to a 4-year-old who had probably never encountered more than one fork per meal. "Different forks are for different types of food," he said carefully. "But you can just use whichever one feels right." "That seems complicated," Marcus observed, selecting the largest fork and examining it closely. "At home, Mama and I use the same forks for everything. It's more efficient." The word efficient coming from a 4-year-old's mouth made Jonathan smile despite the awkwardness of the situation. Marcus possessed a vocabulary that consistently surprised him, using words and concepts that suggested intelligence far beyond his chronological age. Sarah settled into a chair across from Marcus, accepting the freshly prepared omelet that Maria, Jonathan's housekeeper, placed before her with professional efficiency. The older woman moved through the penthouse with the invisible competence of someone accustomed to maintaining luxury for people who could afford perfection. "What would you like for breakfast, sweetheart?" Sarah asked Marcus, who was still exploring the dining room with obvious fascination. "Do you have cereal?" Marcus asked Jonathan directly. "The kind with the tiger on the box?" Jonathan had no idea what cereal featured a tiger, his own breakfast routine consisting of precisely measured portions of Greek yogurt, organic berries, and artisanal granola that cost more per ounce than most breakfast cereals cost per box. "Maria, could you?" he began, then realized he didn't know how to complete the request. "I'll see what we have in the kitchen," Maria replied diplomatically, though her slight smile suggested she was already planning a grocery expedition to stock child-friendly alternatives to the penthouse's current inventory. While Marcus investigated the contents of his orange juice, Glass apparently fascinated by the way the pulp particles moved when he swirled the liquid, Jonathan's phone buzzed with the first of what would be dozens of calls from board members, investors, and media representatives. The display showed David Ashworth's number, and Jonathan knew the conversation would be challenging. "I need to take this," Jonathan told Sarah, moving toward his study. "David, good morning." "Is it?" David's voice carried the clipped tone he used when dealing with crises that threatened company stability. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've created a public relations nightmare that could affect our stock price and investor confidence." Jonathan closed the study door, though he could still hear Marcus's animated chatter as he shared his observations about the apartment with his mother. "The situation is personal, David. It doesn't affect Sterling Dynamics operations or strategic direction." "Everything affects Sterling Dynamics when you're the CEO," David countered. "The speculation about your secret family is already generating headlines in business publications. Investors are asking questions about your judgment, your priorities, and your ability to maintain focus on corporate objectives." The criticism stung because it echoed Jonathan's own concerns about balancing his newfound family responsibilities with the demands of running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He had built his reputation on unwavering commitment to business excellence, often at the expense of personal relationships and emotional attachments that might interfere with optimal decision-making. "My personal life is exactly that personal," Jonathan replied, though he could hear the defensive note in his own voice. "Not when you're worth $12 billion and responsible for 30,000 employees," David said bluntly. "The board is meeting this afternoon to discuss the implications of this situation. Margaret wants to know if you're planning to make any public statements, and Sarah Mitchell is concerned about how this affects our international negotiations." Jonathan felt the familiar pressure of corporate expectations settling on his shoulders like a weight he had forgotten he carried. For the past 18 hours, his attention had been completely absorbed by Marcus and Sarah, by the wonder of discovering fatherhood and the complexity of navigating relationships that couldn't be resolved through strategic planning. The reminder that his business empire continued to require management brought an uncomfortable collision between his two worlds. "Schedule the board meeting for 3 o'clock, Jonathan said finally. "I'll address their concerns then." As he ended the call, Jonathan could hear Marcus asking Sarah detailed questions about the artwork hanging in the dining room, specifically why someone would paint a picture of fruit when they could just look at real fruit. The child's logical approach to abstract concepts reminded Jonathan uncomfortably of his own analytical tendencies, suggesting genetic inheritance that went beyond physical resemblance. Returning to the dining room, Jonathan found Marcus attempting to cut his pancakes with surgical precision, his small tongue protruding slightly as he concentrated on creating perfectly uniform pieces. The attention to detail and systematic approach were unmistakably familiar, echoing Jonathan's own childhood obsession with order and efficiency. "Very neat," Jonathan observed, settling back into his chair. "Mama says I'm particular about things," Marcus replied without looking up from his careful cutting. "I like when things are organized the right way." Sarah caught Jonathan's eye over Marcus's head, her expression suggesting she had noticed the similarity as well. "He arranges his toys by category and color," she explained, "and he gets upset if his books aren't in the right order on his shelf." "What's the right order?" Jonathan asked, genuinely curious about his son's organizational system. Marcus looked up, surprised that an adult would ask such an obvious question. By height first, then by how much I like them, then by color if they're the same height and I like them the same amount. It's the most logical system. The matter-of-fact delivery of this complex classification scheme made Jonathan smile. Marcus had independently developed organizational principles that would be impressive in a graduate student, let alone a 4-year-old. The child's natural inclination towards systematic thinking suggested potential that went far beyond what traditional educational systems might recognize or nurture. That does sound logical, Jonathan agreed. Do you organize other things too? Everything, Marcus replied seriously. Mama's closet was messy, so I fixed it. Now all her shirts are together, and her pants are together, and her shoes are in a line from smallest to biggest. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying genuine affection despite her obvious fatigue. He reorganized my entire bedroom while I was at work last week. I came home to find everything perfectly arranged according to his system. Jonathan felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. His son was clearly gifted, possessing analytical capabilities that many adults never developed. But more than intelligence, Marcus displayed the kind of systematic thinking that could be cultivated into genuine expertise in any field he chose to pursue. The sound of Jonathan's phone ringing interrupted his contemplation. This time the display showed his attorney's number, never a good sign at 9 o'clock in the morning. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, stepping away from the table again. "Richard, what's the situation?" "We may have a problem." Richard Steinberg's voice carried the careful neutrality he used when delivering news that clients wouldn't want to hear. "I've received a call from a family law attorney representing Sarah Collins. They're requesting a meeting to discuss custody arrangements and child support obligations." Jonathan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sarah hired a lawyer? Apparently. The attorney, Jennifer Walsh, very reputable firm, wants to establish formal agreements regarding your parental rights and responsibilities. They're talking about comprehensive custody evaluations, structured visitation schedules, and significant financial support arrangements. The implications hit Jonathan like a physical blow. While he had been trying to learn how to be a father, Sarah had been protecting herself and Marcus through legal channels. The lawyer's involvement suggested she was planning for conflict rather than cooperation, preparing for a battle over their son's future. "What kind of financial support arrangements?" Jonathan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 7 figures annually, plus educational expenses, healthcare coverage, and provisions for housing that meets appropriate standards for a child of your financial status. They're essentially arguing that Marcus is entitled to a lifestyle commensurate with his father's wealth. Jonathan looked back toward the dining room, where Marcus was explaining to Sarah why the syrup should be applied to pancakes in a spiral pattern for optimal distribution. The child seemed completely unaware that his future was being negotiated by lawyers who viewed him as a financial asset rather than a little boy who just wanted to understand why there were so many forks on the table. "Schedule the meeting," Jonathan said quietly. "But I want to talk to Sarah first." After ending the call, Jonathan returned to find Marcus standing at the window again, this time using the binoculars to observe construction work on a building several blocks away. The child provided running commentary on the crane operations, demonstrating remarkable understanding of mechanical processes for someone his age. "Sarah," Jonathan said carefully, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Something in his tone must have communicated the seriousness of the situation, because Sarah immediately looked concerned. "Marcus, keep watching the construction workers while Mama talks to Daddy, okay?" In the privacy of his study, surrounded by the business awards and corporate memorabilia that had once defined his identity, Jonathan faced Sarah with questions he wasn't sure how to ask without sounding accusatory. "Did you hire a lawyer?" he said finally, opting for directness over diplomacy. Sarah's expression immediately shifted to defensive alertness. "How do you know about that?" "My attorney received a call this morning." "Sarah, why would you involve lawyers without talking to me first?" "Because I've seen how you handle business negotiations," Sarah replied, her voice carrying an edge he hadn't heard before. "You research everything. You plan strategies. You control every variable you can. I'm not going to let you treat Marcus like a corporate acquisition." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Jonathan had approached the situation with Marcus analytically, considering practical implications and logistical solutions rather than simply focusing on emotional connections and relationship building. "I'm not trying to acquire anything," Jonathan said. "I'm trying to be a father. And I'm trying to protect my son," Sarah shot back. "Your world operates according to rules I don't understand, with resources I can't match. If we're going to have legal agreements about Marcus's future, I need professional representation to make sure his interests are protected." Jonathan absorbed this, recognizing the logic behind her position, even as it frustrated his desire to handle their relationship through personal communication rather than legal intermediaries. Sarah was operating from a position of practical vulnerability. She couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that Jonathan took for granted, and she couldn't rely on his good intentions when Marcus's future was at stake. "What do you want?" Jonathan asked quietly. "What would make you feel secure about this situation?" Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the same view that had so fascinated Marcus. "I want guarantees that Marcus will always be provided for, regardless of what happens between us. I want assurance that he'll have access to the best educational opportunities, the best health care, the best chance at whatever future he chooses. And in exchange, shared custody, formal recognition of your parental rights, regular visitation schedules that give you time to build a real relationship with him." The terms seemed reasonable, even generous, but Jonathan sensed underlying concerns that Sarah wasn't expressing directly. "What aren't you telling me?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her reflection visible in the window as she considered her response. "I'm afraid you'll get bored," she said finally. "I'm afraid that being a father will turn out to be more work than you expected, more complicated than you planned for. And when that happens, I'm afraid you'll find legal ways to minimize your involvement while still maintaining control over Marcus's life." The fear behind her words revealed depths of concern that Jonathan was only beginning to understand. Sarah wasn't just protecting Marcus from financial uncertainty, she was protecting him from the possibility of emotional abandonment by a father who possessed the resources to remain legally involved while becoming emotionally absent. "I won't get bored," Jonathan said, though he realized how inadequate that assurance sounded. "Sarah, being with Marcus, learning to be his father, it's the most important thing I've ever done." "You've known him for 3 days," Sarah pointed out gently. 3 days isn't enough time to understand what parenting actually involves. The tantrums, the illnesses, the constant questions, the way children can be simultaneously wonderful and exhausting. You haven't experienced any of that yet." Before Jonathan could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face bright with excitement. "Daddy, come see! The construction workers are using a really big crane to move steel beams, and I figured out the pattern they're following." Jonathan followed his son back to the window, where Marcus proceeded to explain his analysis of the construction sequence with remarkable accuracy. The child had observed the work site for less than 30 minutes, but had already identified the systematic approach the workers were using to assemble the building's framework. "See, they're starting with the corner pieces because those provide stability for everything else," Marcus explained, pointing with scientific precision. "Then they're working inward in a spiral pattern because that distributes the weight evenly. It's very efficient." Jonathan found himself genuinely impressed by his son's analytical capabilities. Marcus wasn't just watching construction work. He was understanding the underlying engineering principles and recognizing the strategic thinking behind the workers' approach. "That's exactly right," Jonathan confirmed. "How did you figure that out so quickly?" Marcus shrugged as though the answer were obvious. "I watch how things work, and then I think about why they work that way. Usually there's a pattern, and once you see the pattern, you can predict what happens next." The statement revealed thinking processes that went far beyond typical 4-year-old cognition. Marcus was demonstrating systematic observation, pattern recognition, and predictive analysis skills that formed the foundation of advanced problem-solving in any field. Jonathan's phone buzzed with yet another call, this time from Margaret Chen, regarding the emergency board meeting. As he answered, he watched Marcus continue his construction analysis while Sarah observed both of them with an expression that mixed pride in her son's abilities with concern about the pressures that exceptional intelligence might create in his life. "Jonathan, the board wants specific answers about how your family situation affects corporate strategy." Margaret's voice was businesslike, but tinged with underlying worry. "David is suggesting we need contingency plans in case this becomes a distraction from critical business decisions." "It's not a distraction," Jonathan replied, though he realized his attention had been completely absorbed by Marcus and Sarah for the past several days, leaving corporate matters to function under autopilot systems he had established over years of building sterling dynamics. "The Meridian acquisition is stalled pending your input on integration strategies," Margaret continued. "The Shanghai negotiations require your personal involvement next week, and the quarterly investor presentations need your review and approval. These aren't matters that can be delegated indefinitely." The reminder of his corporate responsibilities created uncomfortable tension between the father he was trying to become and the CEO he had always been. Jonathan had built Sterling Dynamics through total commitment to business excellence, accepting that personal relationships were casualties of professional success. Now, for the first time, he was attempting to maintain both sets of obligations simultaneously. "Schedule everything for after the legal meetings are resolved," Jonathan said finally. "Everything else can wait until next week." "Jonathan, a $12 billion corporation can't wait for personal legal meetings." Margaret's tone carried unusual sharpness. "If you're not available to make critical decisions, the board will need to consider alternative leadership arrangements." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret was suggesting that Jonathan's newfound family responsibilities might compromise his effectiveness as CEO, potentially triggering discussions about succession planning or interim leadership appointments. "I understand the board's concerns," Jonathan replied carefully. "I'll address them at this afternoon's meeting." As he ended the call, Jonathan realized that his attempt to balance fatherhood with corporate leadership was creating exactly the kind of complications that Sarah had feared. His attention was divided between two sets of demands that both required complete commitment, and the strain was already becoming apparent to everyone around him. Marcus, meanwhile, had moved on from construction analysis to examining the books in Jonathan's study, pulling volumes from the shelves and arranging them according to his own organizational system. "Daddy, you have lots of business books, but no storybooks," he observed. "Don't you like stories?" The question highlighted another gap in Jonathan's understanding of childhood development. His personal library consisted entirely of biographies, business strategy texts, and economic analysis materials designed to enhance professional expertise rather than provide entertainment or emotional engagement. "I like stories," Jonathan said, though he realized he couldn't remember the last time he had read fiction or anything designed primarily for enjoyment rather than education. "What kind of stories do you like?" "Adventure stories, and books about how things work, and funny stories that make Mama laugh," Marcus replied, continuing his methodical reorganization of the bookshelf. "Mama reads to me every night. Different voices for all the characters." Jonathan watched his son work, noting the careful attention to detail and the satisfaction Marcus derived from creating order from chaos. The child's natural organizational tendencies suggested intellectual gifts that could be nurtured into extraordinary capabilities with proper guidance and educational opportunities. Sarah appeared in the doorway, having overheard their conversation. "Marcus, you shouldn't reorganize other people's books without asking permission." "But they weren't in any logical order," Marcus protested. "Now they're arranged by subject, then by author's last name within each subject. It's much more efficient." Jonathan examined Marcus's work, finding that the child had indeed created a more logical organizational system than his own haphazard arrangement. "Actually, I like it better this way," he told Marcus. "You can reorganize my books anytime you want." The smile that lit up Marcus's face was worth more than any corporate acquisition Jonathan had ever completed. This was his son, brilliant, systematic, eager to please, and capable of finding joy in simple tasks that adults often viewed as tedious obligations. "Can I help you with your work?" Marcus asked suddenly. "Mama says you make important decisions for lots of people. I'm good at solving problems." The offer was both touching and impractical, but Jonathan found himself considering how he might involve Marcus in age-appropriate aspects of his business activities. The child's analytical thinking and systematic approach could potentially be applied to simplified versions of strategic planning exercises. "Maybe you could help me organize some reports," Jonathan suggested. "Would you like that?" "Yes. I could make charts and graphs and organize everything by importance level," Marcus replied with enthusiasm that most adults reserved for vacation announcements. As Jonathan watched Marcus's excitement about potential involvement in his work, he began to understand what Sarah meant about the complexity of parenting. His son wasn't just seeking attention or entertainment. He was looking for meaningful engagement with the adult world, opportunities to contribute and learn and grow in ways that traditional childhood activities might not provide. The afternoon board meeting loomed ahead, promising difficult conversations about balancing corporate responsibilities with personal commitments. Legal negotiations with Sarah's attorney would require careful navigation to protect Marcus's interests while maintaining the cooperative relationship that effective co-parenting would demand. But for now, in his study, watching Marcus create order from chaos while explaining his organizational philosophy with scientific precision, Jonathan felt something he had never experienced in any boardroom or corporate negotiation: the unconditional love of a child who saw him not as a billionaire CEO, but simply as the daddy who had finally come home. The transformation wasn't complete, and the challenges ahead were significant. But Marcus had already begun changing Jonathan in ways that no business achievement ever could. For the first time in his adult life, Jonathan Sterling was learning that the most important acquisitions couldn't be purchased, negotiated, or strategically planned. They could only be earned through the patient, imperfect, daily work of learning to love and be loved in return. The emergency room at Mount Sinai Hospital hummed with the controlled chaos that characterized urban medical facilities during peak hours, but Sarah Collins barely registered the activity surrounding her as she clutched Marcus's small hand while nurses prepared him for another round of tests. Her son lay pale and still on the hospital bed, his usual boundless energy replaced by the frightening lethargy that had developed over the past 6 hours with terrifying speed. "When did the symptoms first appear?" Dr. Elizabeth Reynolds asked, reviewing the chart while Marcus's temperature reading flashed red on the digital display on 104.2 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerously high despite the aggressive cooling measures they had implemented since his arrival. "This morning he seemed tired, but I thought he was just fighting off a cold," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse from hours of trying to remain calm while her world collapsed around her. "By noon he was complaining of stomach pain. When I picked him up from daycare at 3, he could barely walk. The fever spiked in the car on the way here." Dr. Reynolds nodded grimly, her expression reflecting the seriousness of Marcus's condition. At 38, she possessed the kind of clinical expertise that came from years of treating pediatric emergencies, but even her experienced demeanor couldn't completely mask her concern about the rapid progression of Marcus's symptoms. "The blood work shows elevated white cell counts consistent with a serious bacterial infection," she explained, pointing to numbers on the lab report that meant nothing to Sarah but everything to the medical team fighting to stabilize her son. "We're looking at possible sepsis, which means the infection has entered his bloodstream. The good news is we've caught it early enough to treat aggressively." Sarah felt the familiar crushing weight of financial panic settling on her chest alongside her maternal terror. Sepsis treatment required intensive care, specialized antibiotics, and extended hospitalization medical intervention that could easily cost more than she earned in multiple years, even with the basic insurance coverage her employer provided. "What kind of treatment are we talking about?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Immediate admission to the pediatric intensive care unit, intravenous antibiotic therapy, continuous monitoring, and potentially surgical intervention depending on how he responds to initial treatment," Dr. Reynolds replied, matter-of-factly, "We're looking at a minimum of 5 to 7 days in the PICU, possibly longer if complications develop." The numbers began calculating themselves in Sarah's mind, with the automatic precision that came from years of carefully managing limited financial resources. PICU admission cost thousands of dollars per day. Specialized medications carried price tags that exceeded her monthly rent. Surgical procedures, if necessary, could bankrupt her family permanently. "I need to make some phone calls," Sarah said quietly, stepping away from Marcus's bedside with the terrible recognition that love alone wasn't sufficient to provide the medical care her son required. In the hospital corridor, surrounded by the constant activity of medical professionals moving between emergencies, Sarah dialed Jonathan's number with trembling fingers. Their relationship remained complicated, negotiations with lawyers ongoing, custody arrangements unresolved, but none of those considerations mattered when Marcus's life hung in the balance. Jonathan answered on the first ring, his voice carrying the distracted tone that usually meant he was simultaneously managing multiple corporate crises. "Sarah, I'm in the middle of an emergency board meeting. Can I call you back in an hour?" "Marcus is in the hospital," Sarah said simply, the words cutting through whatever business crisis had captured Jonathan's attention. "He's very sick. I'm at Mount Sinai." The transformation in Jonathan's voice was immediate and complete. The corporate executive disappeared, replaced by a father confronting his worst nightmare. "What happened? How bad is it? I'm leaving now." "Sepsis. They're admitting him to intensive care." Sarah's voice broke slightly as she spoke the diagnosis aloud, making Marcus's condition feel more real and more terrifying. "Jonathan, the treatment is going to be expensive. Very expensive. I don't know how I'm going to afford." "Don't worry about money." Jonathan cut her off with an intensity that brooked no argument. "Whatever he needs, whatever it costs, it's handled. I'm 10 minutes away." Sarah ended the call and returned to Marcus's bedside, where nurses were preparing to move him to the pediatric ICU. Her son's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady, his small face flushed with fever despite the cooling blankets and medications designed to bring his temperature down. "Mama?" Marcus's voice was barely audible, a whisper that carried enormous effort. "Am I going to be okay?" Sarah leaned close, smoothing his dark hair away from his forehead with hands that trembled despite her attempt to project calm confidence. "Yes, sweetheart. The doctors are going to take very good care of you, and Daddy is coming to be with us." "Daddy's coming?" A faint smile crossed Marcus's lips despite his obvious discomfort. "Will he read me stories while I'm sick?" "I'm sure he will," Sarah promised. Though she wasn't certain about anything, except her desperate need for Marcus to recover and her growing recognition that Jonathan's presence had become essential not just for financial reasons, but for emotional ones as well. The PICU occupied an entire floor of the hospital, its sterile corridors lined with private rooms equipped with monitoring equipment that beeped and hummed with electronic vigilance. Marcus was assigned to room 314, a space that managed to be both technologically sophisticated and surprisingly child-friendly, with colorful murals on the walls and specialized furniture designed to accommodate both medical necessity and family comfort. Sarah helped the nurses settle Marcus into his new environment, watching as they connected him to monitors that would track his vital signs continuously. The IV line in his small arm delivered antibiotics and fluids designed to fight the infection ravaging his system, while pulse oximetry sensors monitored his oxygen levels and cardiac rhythm. Jonathan arrived as the medical team was completing Marcus's admission procedures, his usual composed appearance replaced by obvious anxiety and barely controlled panic. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, and his hair disheveled in ways that suggested he had literally run from whatever meeting he had abandoned to reach the hospital. "How is he?" Jonathan asked immediately, his eyes fixed on Marcus's pale face as their son slept fitfully under the influence of pain medication and fever reducers. "Stable for now," Dr. Reynolds reported, joining them beside Marcus's bed. "The antibiotics are beginning to work, but we'll need to monitor him closely for the next 48 hours. Sepsis can be unpredictable, especially in children." Jonathan absorbed this information with the same analytical focus he brought to complex business problems, asking detailed questions about treatment protocols, recovery timelines, and potential complications. But Sarah noticed something different in his demeanor beneath. The systematic information gathering lay emotional vulnerability she had never seen him display before. "Whatever he needs," Jonathan told Dr. Reynolds firmly. "The best specialists, experimental treatments if necessary, transfer to another facility if that would improve his care. Cost is not a consideration." Dr. Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Mr. Sterling, Mount Sinai has excellent pediatric facilities and some of the country's leading specialists in pediatric infectious diseases. Marcus is receiving optimal care here, but I appreciate your commitment to his treatment." As the medical team departed to attend to other patients, Jonathan and Sarah found themselves alone with their sick son for the first time since his condition had deteriorated. The PICU maintained an atmosphere of quiet efficiency, with nurses moving between rooms like guardian angels, armed with medical expertise and parental compassion. "I should have recognized the symptoms earlier," Sarah said quietly, guilt evident in her voice, as she watched Marcus's labored breathing. "This morning he was just tired. I thought it was normal childhood illness." "Sepsis develops rapidly," Jonathan replied, settling into the chair beside Marcus's bed with the careful movements of someone trying not to disturb a sleeping child. "You got him here in time. That's what matters." Jonathan's phone buzzed insistently, displaying urgent messages from his executive team about the board meeting he had abandoned. Sarah watched him glance at the device, then deliberately silence it and place it face down on the bedside table. "Important business?" Sarah asked, noting the gesture. "Nothing more important than this," Jonathan replied without hesitation, reaching out to gently touch Marcus's forehead, checking for fever with the automatic protectiveness that seemed to have emerged overnight in his personality. For the next 6 hours, they maintained a bedside vigil that established a new dynamic in their relationship. Jonathan remained constantly present, leaving Marcus's side only for brief conversations with medical staff or to retrieve coffee and food that neither of them had much appetite to consume. Sarah watched him interact with their son reading stories when Marcus was awake, adjusting blankets when he was sleeping, asking nurses detailed questions about every medication and procedure. "Tell me about the dragon again," Marcus whispered during one of his wakeful periods, his voice still weak but showing slight improvement as the antibiotics began defeating the infection. Jonathan opened the picture book they had requested from the hospital's pediatric library, launching into an animated retelling of the story with character voices that made Marcus smile despite his discomfort. The sight of a billionaire CEO performing dramatic readings for a sick 4-year-old would have seemed absurd in any other context, but in the PICU it felt completely natural. "You're good at this," Sarah observed as Marcus drifted back to sleep, exhausted by the effort of staying awake for the story. "Good at what?" "Being his father. Really being his father, not just acknowledging paternity or providing financial support." Jonathan studied Marcus's peaceful expression, noting the way their son's fever had finally begun to break after hours of medical intervention. "I never understood what I was missing," he admitted quietly. "Before Marcus, I thought success was measured in stock prices and market share. I thought love was a luxury that successful people couldn't afford. And now? Now I realize I had everything backward. Success without family is just elaborate loneliness." Jonathan's phone vibrated again, this time with an urgent call from David Ashworth. Sarah watched Jonathan glance at the display, clearly torn between family obligations and whatever corporate crisis required his immediate attention. "Take it," Sarah said gently. "Marcus is stable, if it's important." Jonathan answered reluctantly, moving to the hallway to avoid disturbing Marcus. Sarah could hear fragments of the conversation through the glass walls, something about a hostile takeover, emergency board sessions, and critical decisions that couldn't be delayed indefinitely. When Jonathan returned 10 minutes later, his expression carried the weight of impossible choices. "We have a problem," he said quietly, settling back into the chair beside Marcus's bed. "Nexus Corporation is attempting a hostile takeover of Sterling Dynamics. They've been acquiring shares quietly for months, and they're making their move while I'm here. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with recognition of the dilemma. You need to go back to work. No, Jonathan said firmly. I need to be here. The board can handle the immediate response, and my lawyers can file injunctions to slow down the takeover process. Jonathan, you could lose your company. I could lose my son. The words carried absolute finality, as though the choice between corporate empire and family loyalty was too obvious to debate. Sterling Dynamics can be rebuilt. Marcus is irreplaceable. Sarah stared at him, searching his face for signs of the calculated decision-making she had learned to expect from him. Instead, she found only genuine certainty, the expression of a man who had finally identified his true priorities and was prepared to defend them regardless of cost. But you've worked your entire life to build that company, Sarah protested. Everything you've achieved, your whole identity. My identity is sitting in that hospital bed, Jonathan interrupted, nodding toward Marcus, who was beginning to stir as his fever continued to break. Everything else is just business. Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Reynolds returned with an update that transformed the atmosphere in the room. Marcus is responding very well to treatment, she announced with obvious satisfaction. His white cell count is dropping, his fever is breaking, and his energy levels are improving. We'll need to keep him for observation for another day or two, but the crisis has passed. The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense, it left her momentarily dizzy. Marcus was going to be okay. The infection that had threatened his life was retreating, defeated by modern medicine and the aggressive treatment that Jonathan's financial resources had made possible without question or delay. Can I go home soon? Marcus asked weakly, his voice stronger than it had been since morning, but still carrying the exhaustion of serious illness. Very soon, Dr. Reynolds assured him. But first you need to rest and let the medicine finish fighting the infection. As the doctor departed, Marcus turned to Jonathan with an expression of innocent trust that broke both parents' hearts. Daddy, did you stay here the whole time I was sick? Of course I did, Jonathan replied, as though no other possibility had ever existed. I wasn't going anywhere while you needed me. Even though you have important work? You're more important than any work I'll ever do. Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement at the transformation she was witnessing. The man who had once dismissed her as insufficient for his world was now dismissing his professional empire as insufficient compared to his responsibility to their son. The change wasn't performance or strategy. It was fundamental alteration of his value system, triggered by unconditional love for a child who had wandered into his conference room seeking a father. Jonathan's phone rang again, this time showing Margaret Chen's number. He glanced at the display, then at Marcus, then deliberately declined the call. You should answer it, Sarah said. Marcus is stable now. You could at least find out what's happening with your company. Jonathan shook his head. Tonight, I'm just Marcus's father. Tomorrow, if necessary, I'll be a CEO again. But right now, this is where I belong. The next morning brought news that confirmed Sarah's fears about the cost of Jonathan's choice. Margaret Chen arrived at the hospital with David Ashworth and Richard Steinberg, their expressions carrying the weight of corporate disaster. The board voted to accept emergency buyout terms from Nexus. Margaret reported quietly, speaking in the hallway outside Marcus's room, where their conversation wouldn't disturb the recovering child. Without your direct involvement in the negotiations, we couldn't mount an effective defense. Jonathan absorbed this information with remarkable calm, as though losing a $12 billion empire was simply another item to be addressed on an agenda. What are the terms? You retain a significant equity position and consulting role, but controlling interest transfers to Nexus, David explained. It's not a complete loss, but Sterling Dynamics as you built it ceases to exist. Sarah listened to this conversation with growing horror at the magnitude of what Jonathan had sacrificed for Marcus's sake. He had chosen their son over everything he had spent decades building, accepting the destruction of his professional legacy to remain present during a medical crisis that had ultimately resolved successfully. I'm sorry, Sarah said when the corporate team departed. I'm sorry you lost your company because of us." Jonathan looked at her with surprise, as though she had missed something fundamental about the situation. "I didn't lose anything that mattered. Marcus is healthy, and we're together as a family. Everything else can be rebuilt. But Sterling Dynamics was your life's work." "No," Jonathan said firmly, settling back into the chair beside Marcus's bed, where their son was coloring in a book provided by the hospital's child life specialists. "My life's work is just beginning. It's teaching Marcus to be a good person, supporting you as his mother, and building something more important than any corporation." "What's that?" "A family that actually functions. A relationship based on trust, rather than legal agreements. A life where success is measured by whether Marcus feels loved and secure, not by stock prices or quarterly earnings." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she recognized the complete sincerity behind Jonathan's words. This wasn't corporate rhetoric or negotiation strategy, it was genuine transformation, triggered by 48 hours of confronting what truly mattered when everything else fell away. "Marcus was right about you," Sarah said quietly. "What do you mean?" "From the first moment he saw you, he knew you were his father. Not because you looked alike, but because he recognized something essential. Children see things adults miss sometimes." Jonathan watched Marcus carefully selecting colors for his drawing, his small tongue protruding slightly as he concentrated on staying within the lines. "What did he see?" "Someone who would choose him over everything else when it really mattered. Someone who would stay beside his hospital bed instead of attending emergency board meetings. Someone who would sacrifice a corporate empire rather than miss bedtime stories." The insight struck Jonathan with unexpected force. Marcus had somehow perceived qualities in him that Jonathan himself hadn't recognized: potential for unconditional love, capacity for sacrifice, willingness to prioritize family over professional achievement. The child had seen the father he could become rather than the businessman he had been. "I want to withdraw the custody lawsuit," Sarah said suddenly, the decision emerging from her growing recognition of Jonathan's genuine commitment to their family. "Not because of the money or the medical bills, but because Marcus needs both of us working together, not against each other through lawyers." Jonathan felt relief wash over him, not because legal victory had been achieved, but because cooperation had become possible. "What do you want instead?" "Partnership. Real partnership in raising him, making decisions about his future, providing the stability he needs to grow up feeling secure and loved. Even though I just lost most of my financial resources?" Sarah smiled, the expression carrying warmth he hadn't seen since their early relationship years ago. "Jonathan, you have more than enough money to last several lifetimes, even after the buyout. But more importantly, you have something that can't be purchased or negotiated: Marcus's absolute trust and love." "And yours?" Jonathan asked quietly, surprised by his own vulnerability in asking the question. "That depends," Sarah replied, moving closer to Marcus's bed where their son was proudly displaying his completed coloring page featuring a family of dinosaurs. "Can you handle being just Marcus's father sometimes, instead of always being Jonathan Sterling, the CEO?" "I think I've already answered that question," Jonathan said, gesturing toward the hospital room where he had spent the past 2 days attending to their son's needs while his corporate empire collapsed around him. "Everything else can wait. This can't." Marcus looked up from his artwork, his face bright with the returning energy that signaled his recovery. "Look, I drew our family. There's Mama and Daddy and me, and we're all together." The picture was rendered in the bold, imperfect strokes that characterized 4-year-old artistry, but the message was unmistakable. 3 figures holding hands, standing beneath a bright yellow sun, surrounded by flowers and trees that suggested growth and happiness. "It's beautiful," Jonathan said, accepting the drawing with the reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts. "Can I keep it?" "It's for your office," Marcus explained seriously. "So when you're at work, you can remember that we're your family." Jonathan studied the drawing, noting the careful way Marcus had positioned the 3 figures with equal prominence, suggesting a child's understanding that families required balance and mutual commitment rather than hierarchical dominance. "Actually," Jonathan said, making a decision that surprised him with its clarity. "I think I'm going to need a new office. Maybe something closer to home, where I can see you more often." The next week brought a series of changes that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Jonathan established a new venture capital firm focused on medical technology investments, work that allowed him flexible scheduling and meaningful purpose while rebuilding his professional identity around family priorities. Sarah accepted a position as Director of Childhood Development at a private school that valued her expertise and provided excellent benefits, including healthcare coverage that ensured Marcus would never again face medical crises without optimal treatment options. Marcus, fully recovered from his illness, adapted to their new family dynamic with the resilience that seemed to characterize his approach to all of life's changes. He divided his time between his parents' homes, thrived in his new school environment, and continued to astonish adults with his analytical intelligence and emotional maturity. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything had instead created the foundation for something stronger and more meaningful than any of them had previously imagined. Jonathan had learned that success without family was ultimately meaningless. Sarah had discovered that trust could be rebuilt through actions rather than promises. And Marcus had gained the security of knowing that both parents would choose him over everything else when difficult decisions needed to be made. The family drawn in crayon by a 4-year-old's hand had become reality through the crucible of medical emergency and corporate crisis, proving that sometimes the most important acquisitions couldn't be planned or negotiated. They could only be earned through the patient, imperfect work of learning to love without reservation. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Jonathan's new office in Tribeca, casting warm, geometric patterns across the hardwood floors that Marcus had personally helped select during their weekend renovation project 3 months earlier. The space bore little resemblance to the sterile corporate environment that had defined Jonathan's previous professional identity. Exposed brick walls displayed Marcus's artwork alongside business awards. Comfortable seating areas invited collaboration rather than intimidation, and a corner dedicated to Marcus's activities suggested a workplace designed around family integration rather than family exclusion. Jonathan sat at his desk, reviewing proposals for the Sterling Family Foundation's latest initiative when the soft chime of the elevator announced his son's arrival. At 5 years old, Marcus moved through the office with the confidence of someone who belonged there, greeting employees by name and offering observations about their work with the analytical precision that continued to amaze everyone who encountered him. "Good morning, Dad," Marcus said, settling into the child-sized chair that occupied a permanent position beside Jonathan's desk. The formality of his greeting had evolved over the past year from "Daddy" to "Dad," a linguistic shift that reflected his growing maturity while maintaining the warmth that had characterized their relationship from its beginning. "Good morning, Marcus. How was school yesterday?" Jonathan asked, closing the proposal folder to give his son complete attention, a practice he had established during their early days together and maintained despite the increasing demands of his new venture. "Excellent. Mrs. Patterson says my science project about renewable energy sources demonstrates graduate-level understanding of environmental systems," Marcus replied matter-of-factly, pulling out a tablet to show Jonathan his latest work. "I've been thinking about your foundation's next project. Have you considered targeting single-parent households specifically affected by climate change impacts?" Jonathan studied his son's presentation with the same careful attention he had once reserved for billion-dollar acquisition proposals. Marcus had independently researched correlation patterns between environmental disasters and single-parent family stability, creating data visualizations that would have impressed corporate analysts twice his age. "This is remarkable work," Jonathan said, genuinely amazed by the sophistication of Marcus's analysis. "How did you think to connect environmental issues with family stability?" "Logical progression," Marcus explained, his tone suggesting the answer was obvious. "Single parents have fewer resources to recover from disasters like floods or hurricanes. They're more likely to lose housing, employment, and childcare support when environmental emergencies disrupt community infrastructure. The foundation could create emergency response protocols specifically designed for their needs. The insight revealed thinking that went beyond academic intelligence to genuine empathy for vulnerable populations, a combination of analytical capability and social awareness that represented the best qualities inherited from both parents. Marcus possessed Jonathan's systematic approach to problem-solving, combined with Sarah's intuitive understanding of human needs and community dynamics. "Would you like to present this idea to the foundation board next week?" Jonathan asked, noting the way Marcus's eyes lit up with excitement at the prospect of formal involvement in meaningful work. "Really? I could do an actual presentation?" Marcus's careful composure cracked slightly, revealing the 5-year-old enthusiasm beneath his precocious exterior. "With charts and data and everything?" "With charts and data and everything," Jonathan confirmed, smiling at his son's excitement. "But first, we should review it with your mother. Make sure she approves of you taking on additional responsibilities." The mention of Sarah brought a subtle shift in Marcus's expression, not unhappiness, but the careful consideration he applied to situations involving both parents. Over the past year, their family had developed intricate dynamics that balanced Jonathan's resources and ambitions with Sarah's values and protective instincts, creating a partnership that worked precisely because both parents had learned to compromise without surrendering their core principles. "Mom already reviewed it," Marcus said, producing a tablet with detailed notes in Sarah's handwriting. "She helped me research the social services components and suggested I include recommendations for community partnership strategies. She says it's important to understand the human elements, not just the data patterns." Jonathan examined Sarah's contributions to Marcus's proposal, noting the way she had guided their son to consider emotional and social factors that his analytical mind might have overlooked. Her input had transformed Marcus's project from a purely academic exercise into a comprehensive strategy that addressed both systemic problems and individual needs. The collaborative approach to Marcus's development represented one of the most successful aspects of their co-parenting arrangement. Sarah had accepted Jonathan's place in their lives, not by abandoning her own values, but by insisting that those values remain central to Marcus's upbringing. She had agreed to financial support and educational opportunities while maintaining veto power over decisions that might compromise their son's character or priorities. "Your mother is very smart about people," Jonathan observed, a comment that carried deeper meaning about his growing appreciation for qualities he had once failed to recognize or value adequately. "She says you're smart about systems," Marcus replied with the diplomatic precision he had developed for navigating conversations that touched on his parents' relationship. "Together, you understand both sides of problems." The insight, delivered with characteristic directness, revealed Marcus's sophisticated understanding of how his parents' different strengths complemented each other. At 5, he already grasped concepts about partnership and collaboration that many adults struggle to implement in their own relationships. Jonathan's assistant, Patricia Williams, appeared in the doorway with the respectful deference she showed when Marcus was present. Over the past year, the entire office had adapted to accommodate a child's regular presence, with staff members learning to moderate their language, adjust meeting schedules around school pickup times, and include Marcus in appropriate workplace activities. "Mr. Sterling, the Foundation Board is arriving for the quarterly review," Patricia announced. "Should I set up the presentation materials in the conference room?" "Yes. And please, make sure Marcus's materials are included in the agenda," Jonathan replied. "He'll be presenting his environmental initiative proposal today." Patricia's expression showed no surprise at a 5-year-old's inclusion in a board meeting. The Sterling Family Foundation operated according to principles that prioritized substance over traditional hierarchies, evaluating ideas based on merit rather than the age or credentials of their originators. "Of course, sir. I'll arrange child-appropriate refreshments as well." As Patricia departed to prepare for the meeting, Marcus returned to his tablet, making final adjustments to his presentation with the methodical focus that characterized all his academic work. Jonathan watched his son's concentration, marveling at the child's ability to balance sophisticated intellectual capabilities with age-appropriate social development. The past year had provided numerous opportunities to observe Marcus navigating between different worlds: the privileged environment of Jonathan's professional circle and the practical community where Sarah maintained their family's emotional foundation. Marcus moved seamlessly between both contexts, demonstrating remarkable adaptability while maintaining core values that reflected both parents' influence. "Dad, can I ask you something personal?" Marcus said suddenly, looking up from his tablet with the serious expression he wore when addressing topics that required careful consideration. "Always," Jonathan replied, recognizing the gravity that preceded important questions from his son. "Do you miss your old company, Sterling Dynamics? Do you ever regret giving it up for our family?" The question carried weight that went beyond simple curiosity. Marcus was asking whether Jonathan's transformation had involved genuine sacrifice, whether family loyalty had come at the cost of professional fulfillment, whether love had proven adequate compensation for the corporate empire he had surrendered. Jonathan considered his response carefully, recognizing that his answer would influence Marcus's understanding of priorities, sacrifice, and the true nature of success. "I miss some aspects of it," he said honestly. "The complexity of large-scale problem-solving, the resources to implement ambitious projects, the satisfaction of building something significant. But you don't regret it?" "Not for a moment. Sterling Dynamics was something I built for myself. The foundation is something we're building together, as a family. The work is more meaningful because it includes you and your mother." Marcus absorbed this explanation with the analytical consideration he brought to complex concepts. "So you traded something big for something better?" "I traded something impressive for something important. The difference is significant." Before Marcus could respond, the conference room began filling with Foundation Board members arriving for their quarterly review. The Sterling Family Foundation's board included former corporate executives, social services professionals, academic researchers, and community organizers, a deliberately diverse group selected to provide multiple perspectives on family support initiatives. Jonathan had established the foundation 6 months after the hospital crisis, using the proceeds from Sterling Dynamics' buyout to create an endowment focused on supporting single-parent households. The organization's mission reflected his growing understanding of the challenges Sarah had faced raising Marcus alone, combined with his desire to use his resources for purposes that transcended simple wealth accumulation. "Ready for your first board presentation?" Jonathan asked, as they prepared to enter the conference room. "Ready," Marcus confirmed, gathering his materials with the careful organization that characterized all his academic endeavors. "Mom says the most important part is helping people understand why the work matters, not just showing them impressive data." The conference room buzzed with conversation as board members reviewed quarterly reports and discussed upcoming initiatives. When Jonathan and Marcus entered, the room's energy shifted subtly, accommodating the presence of a child who had become an integral part of the foundation's identity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan began, taking his place at the head of the conference table while Marcus settled into a chair that had been adjusted to appropriate height. "Before we review this quarter's activities, I'd like Marcus to present a proposal he's developed for our next major initiative." Marcus stood with poise that would have been impressive in an adult, let alone a 5-year-old addressing a room full of experienced professionals. His presentation skills had developed through practice sessions with both parents, combining Jonathan's systematic approach with Sarah's emphasis on emotional connection and authentic communication. "Good afternoon," Marcus began, his voice clear and confident. "My proposal addresses emergency support for single-parent families affected by climate-related disasters. Through research conducted with my mother's guidance, I've identified specific vulnerabilities that existing disaster relief programs don't adequately address." For the next 15 minutes, Marcus presented his analysis with remarkable sophistication, using data visualizations to illustrate correlation patterns while weaving in human stories that demonstrated the real-world impact of policy gaps. His recommendations included emergency childcare provisions, accelerated housing assistance, and community resilience programs designed around single-parent household needs. The board members listened with expressions ranging from amazement to genuine engagement with the substantive content of Marcus's proposal. Questions followed that treated him as a serious contributor rather than a precocious child, acknowledging both his analytical capabilities and the validity of his research findings. "Marcus, your research methodology is quite impressive," observed Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the Foundation's social services advisor. "How did you decide to focus on community partnership strategies rather than direct financial assistance?" "Direct assistance provides temporary relief, but community partnerships create sustainable support systems," Marcus replied without hesitation. "When single parents have reliable networks, they're better equipped to handle future emergencies independently. It's more efficient, long-term." Jonathan felt pride swell in his chest as he watched his son field questions with confidence and sophistication. Marcus possessed not just intelligence, but wisdom, the ability to see beyond immediate problems to systemic solutions, combined with genuine concern for people facing difficult circumstances. After Marcus concluded his presentation and departed for school with Sarah, who had arrived to observe her son's board debut, the remaining meeting focused on implementation strategies for his proposal. The board's enthusiasm was unanimous. Marcus's environmental initiative would become the Foundation's flagship program for the coming year. "Remarkable child," commented Robert Chen, the Foundation's financial advisor, as the meeting concluded. "His analytical capabilities rival those of graduate students, but he maintains genuine empathy for the populations he's studying." "He gets the empathy from his mother," Jonathan replied, watching through the window as Sarah and Marcus waited for their car. "The analytical thinking, that's a collaborative development." The afternoon proceeded with routine Foundation business grant approvals, partnership negotiations, and strategic planning for upcoming initiatives. But Jonathan found his attention consistently drawn to the window, where Manhattan's bustling activity reminded him of the journey that had brought him from corporate isolation to family integration. 18 months earlier, he had measured success exclusively through stock prices and market dominance. Today, his most significant achievement was a 5-year-old's confidence in presenting environmental policy recommendations to experienced professionals. The transformation hadn't diminished his capabilities or ambitions. It had redirected them toward purposes that felt genuinely meaningful. At 6 o'clock, Jonathan closed his laptop and gathered the materials he would review at home that evening. The Foundation's work required the same analytical rigor and strategic thinking that had characterized his corporate career, but the motivation was entirely different. Instead of building wealth for shareholders, he was creating opportunities for families to build stability and security. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Marcus wants to know if you're coming for dinner. He's making his famous spaghetti with mathematical precision." The message carried the warmth that had gradually returned to their relationship as trust replaced legal agreements and cooperation superseded conflict. Jonathan's relationship with Sarah had evolved into something neither romantic love nor mere co-parenting arrangement, but rather a partnership built around shared commitment to Marcus's well-being. They had learned to appreciate each other's strengths while respecting the boundaries that maintained their individual autonomy. Sarah had accepted Jonathan's place in their lives by insisting that his presence enhance rather than overwhelm the family dynamic they had established. She welcomed his resources and opportunities while maintaining veto power over decisions that might compromise Marcus's character development or social awareness. The arrangement worked because both parents had undergone fundamental changes during their reconciliation process. Jonathan had learned to value emotional intelligence alongside analytical capabilities. Sarah had learned to accept help while maintaining independence, recognizing that partnership didn't require surrendering personal identity. Jonathan's penthouse had been transformed to accommodate their blended family structure, with Marcus maintaining his own room while Sarah kept her separate apartment in Queens. The child moved fluidly between both environments, adapting his behavior to each setting while maintaining consistent values and expectations. "Dad's here," Marcus announced as Jonathan entered Sarah's apartment, using keys she had provided 6 months earlier when their arrangement had shifted from formal visitation schedules to informal family integration. The apartment had undergone subtle improvements, new appliances that Sarah had finally agreed to accept, educational materials that supported Marcus's advanced learning needs, and security upgrades that provided peace of mind without altering the neighborhood character she valued. "How did the presentation go?" Sarah asked, emerging from the kitchen where something delicious was simmering. Her question carried genuine interest rather than parental anxiety. She had observed Marcus's preparation process and trusted both his capabilities and Jonathan's support. "Exceptional," Jonathan replied, settling onto the familiar sofa where he had first read bedtime stories to his son. The board approved his proposal unanimously. Marcus will be leading the Foundation's next major initiative. "Leading might be overstating it," Sarah said with gentle humor. "But contributing meaningfully, absolutely." Marcus appeared with a detailed chart showing his spaghetti preparation methodology, complete with timing sequences and quality control checkpoints. "I've optimized the cooking process for maximum efficiency while maintaining optimal flavor profiles," he announced seriously. Jonathan examined the chart with the same attention he would give any professional presentation, noting the sophisticated understanding of process optimization that Marcus had applied to pasta preparation. "Very impressive. Have you considered publishing your methodology?" "Mom says cooking should be about love, not just efficiency," Marcus replied, glancing between his parents with the diplomatic awareness he had developed for topics that touched on their different approaches to life. "So, I'm working on incorporating emotional elements into the process." The comment revealed Marcus's ongoing effort to integrate lessons from both parents. Jonathan's systematic approach to problem-solving with Sarah's emphasis on human connection and authentic relationships. At 5, he was already learning to balance analytical thinking with emotional intelligence. Dinner conversation focused on Marcus's upcoming school presentation about renewable energy, Sarah's new responsibilities at the private school where she had been promoted to assistant director, and Jonathan's plans for expanding the Foundation's reach into rural communities. The topics ranged from academic to professional to personal, reflecting a family dynamic that valued both individual achievement and mutual support. "Can I make an announcement?" Marcus said as they finished eating, his tone carrying the formality he used for important declarations. "Of course," Jonathan and Sarah replied simultaneously, then shared a look of amusement at their synchronized response. Marcus stood beside his chair, assuming the presentation posture he had perfected through months of practice. "I've been thinking about our family structure, and I have a proposal for your consideration." Jonathan felt his breath catch, wondering what kind of proposal a 5-year-old might make about family arrangements that had taken adults months to negotiate and implement. "I think we should make our partnership official," Marcus continued, his expression serious. "Not marriage or anything complicated like that, but a formal family agreement that recognizes our commitment to working together for everyone's benefit." Sarah and Jonathan exchanged glances across the table, both surprised by their son's sophistication in addressing relationship dynamics that they had carefully avoided defining too precisely. "What kind of formal agreement?" Sarah asked, her tone carefully neutral despite her obvious curiosity about Marcus's thinking. "A family mission statement," Marcus explained, producing a tablet with a document he had obviously prepared in advance. "Something that establishes our shared values, our individual responsibilities, and our collective goals." Jonathan accepted the tablet, finding a remarkably thoughtful document that outlined principles for decision-making, conflict resolution, and mutual support. Marcus had created a framework for family governance that balanced individual autonomy with collective responsibility. "This is quite sophisticated," Jonathan observed, scrolling through sections that addressed everything from education decisions to financial planning to holiday traditions. "How long have you been working on this?" 3 weeks, Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "I researched successful partnership models in various contexts and adapted the principles for family application." Sarah read over Jonathan's shoulder, her expression shifting from surprise to admiration as she absorbed their son's comprehensive approach to formalizing their relationship. "Marcus, this is really thoughtful, but why do you think we need a formal agreement?" "Because successful partnerships require clear communication about expectations and boundaries," Marcus explained with the confidence of someone presenting obvious solutions to complex problems. You and Dad work well together because you've learned to respect each other's different approaches. A mission statement would help maintain that balance as our family continues developing. The insight revealed understanding that went far beyond Marcus's chronological age, demonstrating awareness of relationship dynamics that many adults struggled to articulate. He had observed his parents' interactions closely enough to identify the principles that made their partnership successful. "I think it's a wonderful idea," Jonathan said finally, recognizing the value in Marcus's systematic approach to family building. "Should we work on it together?" "I was hoping you would say that," Marcus replied, his careful composure dissolving into the bright smile that always reminded Jonathan of their first meeting in the conference room. "I think it could be really special if we all contribute our ideas." The following month passed quickly as the family collaborated on their mission statement, with Marcus facilitating discussions that helped Jonathan and Sarah articulate values they had developed intuitively but never formally expressed. The process strengthened their partnership while giving Marcus meaningful involvement in shaping their family's future direction. Spring arrived with the Foundation's first major conference, bringing together single parents, social services professionals, and policy advocates from across the country. Marcus had been invited to present his environmental initiative, marking his transition from Foundation family member to recognized contributor in his own right. The conference venue, a Manhattan hotel ballroom that had hosted corporate events throughout Jonathan's previous career, buzzed with conversation as attendees gathered for the opening session. Marcus moved through the crowd with increasing confidence, introducing himself to participants and listening to their stories with the genuine interest that characterized his approach to learning about people and communities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan addressed the audience from the podium where he had once delivered corporate presentations to very different audiences for very different purposes. "Welcome to the Sterling Family Foundation's inaugural conference on innovative approaches to single-parent support." The opening session proceeded with presentations from researchers, practitioners, and community organizers, establishing the context for Marcus's appearance later in the program. Jonathan watched from the audience as his son sat in the front row, taking notes with characteristic precision while absorbing information that would influence his ongoing work. When Marcus's time came, he approached the podium with the poised confidence that had developed through months of practice and encouragement. The audience, several hundred adults committed to family support work, gave him their complete attention, recognizing that his presence represented something significant about the Foundation's values and approach. "My name is Marcus Sterling," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sophisticated audio system. "I'm 5 years old, and I live with a single mother who raised me for the first 4 years of my life without any support from my father." The personal introduction immediately captured the audience's attention, establishing Marcus not just as the Foundation director's son, but as someone with direct experience of the issues they had gathered to address. "Last year, my father entered our lives and had to learn how to be a parent while my mother had to learn how to accept help without losing her independence," Marcus continued. "Through watching their partnership develop, I've learned important lessons about how support systems can strengthen families without undermining their autonomy." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus presented his environmental initiative with sophistication that impressed the professional audience while maintaining the authentic voice of a child who understood these issues personally. His recommendations addressed policy gaps, community needs, and systematic approaches to building resilience among vulnerable families. The standing ovation that followed his presentation reflected genuine appreciation for both the content of his proposal and the remarkable poise he had demonstrated. But Jonathan felt proud, not just of Marcus's intellectual achievements, but of his character, the empathy, humility, and social awareness that complemented his analytical capabilities. "Questions?" Marcus asked, accepting the microphone with the confidence of someone comfortable addressing adult audiences. A social worker from Detroit raised her hand. "Marcus, your proposal emphasizes community partnerships. How do you think organizations can build trust with single parents who might be reluctant to accept help? Start by listening instead of assuming you know what they need," Marcus replied without hesitation. My mom says the most important thing helpers can do is respect people's expertise about their own lives. The insight, delivered in a child's direct voice, carried wisdom that many professional support programs struggled to implement. Marcus had identified a fundamental principle about effective assistance, that successful help honored recipients' knowledge and autonomy rather than imposing external solutions. Additional questions followed, with Marcus demonstrating remarkable ability to address complex policy issues while maintaining perspective grounded in personal experience and genuine concern for vulnerable families. His responses revealed thinking that went beyond academic analysis to include emotional intelligence and social awareness. As the session concluded and participants moved toward reception areas, Jonathan found himself surrounded by attendees, expressing amazement at Marcus's presentation and asking about the Foundation's approach to including diverse voices in program development. "Your son is extraordinary," commented Dr. Lisa Washington, a family policy researcher from Chicago. "His combination of analytical thinking and emotional intelligence suggests remarkable potential for future contributions to social policy development." "He gets the best qualities from both parents," Jonathan replied, watching as Marcus moved through the reception crowd, listening carefully to stories from single parents about their experiences and challenges. Sarah joined them, having observed the presentation from the back of the ballroom with obvious pride in their son's achievement. "He did wonderfully," she said, accepting compliments from attendees who recognized her as the single mother Marcus had referenced in his introduction. "The Foundation is fortunate to have such insightful leadership," Dr. Washington continued, "both formal and informal." As the evening progressed, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months earlier, he had been an isolated corporate executive whose life was defined entirely by professional achievement and financial accumulation. Tonight, he stood in a ballroom filled with people committed to strengthening families, watching his 5-year-old son engage adults in sophisticated discussions about social policy and community support. The transformation hadn't diminished his capabilities or reduced his influence. It had redirected both toward purposes that felt genuinely meaningful. The Foundation's work required the same analytical rigor and strategic thinking that had characterized his corporate career, but the motivation was entirely different, building opportunities for families rather than wealth for shareholders. "Time to go home," Sarah announced as the reception wound down and Marcus began showing signs of the exhaustion that followed major presentations. "Can we stop for ice cream?" Marcus asked, his formal conference demeanor dissolving into age-appropriate enthusiasm. "Presenting to grown-ups makes me hungry for celebration food." Jonathan laughed, recognizing his son's logical approach to rewarding achievement while maintaining perspective about what mattered most. "Ice cream sounds perfect." As they left the hotel together, Jonathan, Sarah, and Marcus, walking through Manhattan's evening energy toward their car, Jonathan realized that his greatest acquisition had indeed been the family he never knew he had. Not because he had purchased or negotiated their affection, but because he had learned to earn their love through the patient, imperfect work of becoming someone worthy of their trust. The 5-year-old who had burst into his conference room declaring their resemblance had seen potential that Jonathan himself hadn't recognized. Marcus had identified someone who could choose family over everything else when it really mattered. Someone who could sacrifice corporate empire for bedtime stories. Someone who could find meaning in partnership rather than dominance. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, Jonathan stood once again before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, but this time Marcus stood beside him in a conference room at the Foundation's headquarters. They were preparing for the quarterly board meeting that would review the environmental initiative's remarkable success and plan expansion into additional regions. "Ready for another presentation?" Jonathan asked, adjusting Marcus's tie with the paternal pride that had become central to his identity. "Ready," Marcus confirmed, gathering his materials with characteristic precision. "But this time, I want to start by thanking the board for believing that good ideas can come from anyone, regardless of age." Jonathan smiled, recognizing both his own systematic approach and Sarah's emphasis on gratitude and humility in his son's planned introduction. Marcus had learned to integrate the best qualities from both parents while developing his own authentic voice and perspective. The boardroom filled with familiar faces Foundation members who had watched Marcus grow from a precocious child into a recognized contributor to their organization's mission. His environmental initiative had exceeded all projections, providing emergency support to over 3,000 single-parent households while establishing community partnerships that created sustainable resilience programs. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan began, taking his place at the head of the conference table while Marcus settled confidently into his chair. "Before we review this quarter's remarkable achievements, Marcus would like to present our next expansion proposal." As his son stood to address the board, with poise that would have been impressive at any age, Jonathan realized that the greatest acquisition of his life continued growing in value every day. Not through market appreciation or strategic positioning, but through the accumulating wealth of shared experiences, mutual trust, and unconditional love that could never be purchased or negotiated. The cold businessman who had once dismissed a pregnant girlfriend as insufficient for his world had learned that the greatest success couldn't be measured in stock prices or quarterly earnings. It could only be measured in the confident smile of a child who knew his father would choose him over everything else, every time, without question or hesitation. Marcus began his presentation with the gratitude he had promised, thanking the board for their support while establishing the context for his new proposal. Jonathan listened with the pride that had replaced corporate ambition as his primary source of satisfaction, recognizing that his transformation from CEO to father had been the most profitable transaction of his life. The acquisition was complete, but the returns would continue growing for generations to come.